close your eyes if you would like. Take a slow breath in and let it out just as slowly. There is nowhere you need to be right now. There is nothing waiting for you on the other side of this moment. You are here, and that is more than enough. Let the weight of the day begin to settle downward, like silt drifting quietly to the bottom of a still, clear pool. Tonight, we are going to travel together, very gently, very slowly, to a place that has lived in the human imagination for a very long time. We are going to visit a story that began with a philosopher sitting at his desk in Athens, dipping a reed pen into a small clay pot of ink and writing down, in careful and unhurried words, the most extraordinary tale he had ever heard. His name was Plato. The year was approximately 360 before the Common Era, and the story he wrote down was about a place called Atlantis. Now, before we go any further, I want you to settle just a little more deeply into wherever you are resting. Feel the surface beneath you, the gentle pressure of it supporting your body. Feel the warmth of the air around you. Let your shoulders drop, just slightly. Let your jaw unclench if it has tightened. Let your hands rest open and still. We are going to take our time tonight. There is no hurry. This story has been waiting for over 2,000 years, and it will wait a little longer while you find your comfort. When you are ready, and only when you are ready, let us begin. Imagine, for just a moment, the quality of light in Athens in the late afternoon of a long Mediterranean summer. The sun does not descend quickly there. It takes its time, moving in a slow arc across a sky that is nearly always the color of pale blue linen, the kind of blue that exists just before it becomes white. The heat during the day is dry and calm, not oppressive, just present. The stones of the city, limestone and marble, absorb that heat all day long, and in the early evening they give it back gently, so that even after the sun has gone below the horizon, the streets and the steps and the colonnades are still faintly warm to the touch. In this Athens, in this particular afternoon in the year 360 BC, an old man is walking slowly along a covered walkway near the edge of the Agora, the great open marketplace at the heart of the city. He is perhaps in his late 60s, though he carries himself with the careful dignity of a man who has decided that age is something to be inhabited rather than resisted. His name is Plato, and he is not yet finished with his work. He has already written many things, dialogues, mostly carefully constructed conversations between his old teacher Socrates and various citizens of Athens, conversations designed to illuminate questions about justice, beauty, knowledge, the nature of the soul. He is, by this point in his life, one of the most famous philosophers in the Greek-speaking world. He runs a school called the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western tradition, and students come from distant cities to sit in its gardens and argue about the nature of reality. But today, Plato is thinking about something older, something he first heard spoken of in whispers, repeated in stories, traced back through generations to a source so ancient it feels more like myth than history, though the old Egyptians, who kept their records more carefully than anyone, insisted that it was history, that it had actually happened, that the world had once contained something extraordinary. And that something was now gone. He is thinking about Atlantis, and he is going to write it down. Breathe in slowly. Breathe out slowly. Let's not rush toward the catastrophe, toward the ending that everyone already knows, or thinks they know. Let us instead do something much more peaceful. Let us go to Atlantis, not in the moment of its disappearing, but in an ordinary moment, a quiet morning, a day like any other day in that remarkable civilization. Because that is, in many ways, the most comforting thing about this story. It is not just about endings. It is about the 10,000 ordinary days that came before the ending. The mornings, the meals, the slow conversations by the harbor, the smell of salt water and stone, the sound of children playing in a courtyard somewhere, their voices high and light and carrying no weight of history at all. Let us go to those ordinary days. Let us walk there slowly and quietly as a visitor who asks very little and observes very much. Let us go to Atlantis. Before we meet the people, let us spend some time with the land itself, because the land matters. The shape of a place, its hills and its harbors, its rivers and its plains, shapes the people who live on it in ways so deep and so gradual that they are almost invisible. You do not notice how a landscape forms you any more than a fish notices the water, but it does form you, always. Plato described Atlantis with a specificity that was unusual for something he claimed was pure myth. He gave measurements. He gave directions. He described the shape of the coastline and the arrangement of the harbors and the color of the stone in the mountains with the kind of detail that belongs to someone who is either reporting what they were told or who is a very meticulous inventor of worlds. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. It does not matter for our purposes which it was. What matters is the picture, and the picture is beautiful. Imagine an island, a large island, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, Plato said, though this may be a measure of its significance rather than its literal size. An island rising from the Atlantic Ocean, far to the west of the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage of water between the southern tip of Europe and the northern coast of Africa. In Plato's time, this was the edge of the known world. Beyond those pillars, the ocean stretched out into the unknown, vast and gray and deep. And somewhere in that unknown ocean, sitting like a dream in the middle of blue water, was this island. Imagine approaching it by sea. You would see it first as a dark shape on the horizon, something that might be a cloud at first, low and horizontal, but with too much solidity to be a cloud, too much permanence. As your ship drew closer, the shapes would resolve themselves into mountains, a ring of mountains along the northern coast, high enough that their peaks were sometimes wrapped in cloud, their slopes covered in deep green forest. These mountains protected the interior of the island from the cold northern winds, so that everything south of them was warm and sheltered, like a garden cupped in enormous hands. Below the mountains, as you drew nearer still, you would see the plain. It was vast. Plato described it as perfectly rectangular, which suggests that either nature had arranged it with unusual precision, or that the Atlanteans had shaped it, leveled it, made it into something intentional. 3,000 states in one direction, 2,000 in another. That is roughly 550 kilometers by 360. An enormous flat expanse of extraordinarily fertile land. And sitting at the southern end of this plain, right where the land met the sea, was the city. Let us pause here for a moment. Let us simply look at it from a distance, from the deck of a slow-moving ship on a calm day, with the sun gentle overhead, and a slight breeze carrying the smell of the open ocean, and, faintly now, the smell of land, warm stone and vegetation, and the particular sweetness of fresh water meeting salt. The city is arranged in rings, concentric rings of land and water, alternating, centered on a low hill at the very middle where the oldest buildings stand. From a distance, it looks almost like something natural, like the pattern left in a pool of water when a stone is dropped into it, the rings expanding outward in perfect circles. But of course, it is not natural. It is the most deliberate thing you have ever seen. Someone, many someones, across many generations, built this city with an idea in mind, with a vision of what ordered, harmonious human life could look like when given enough time and enough will to achieve it. The outermost ring of water is the largest, and it connects to the sea through a great channel, wide enough for large ships to pass. As you sail through this channel, slowly, because this is a place that invites slowness, you pass from the open sea into the sheltered world of the city itself. And the change is immediate and noticeable. The sound of the waves softens. The light changes, filtered now by the great walls along either side of the channel, their stones warm gold and white in the afternoon sun. Other ships pass you, moving in and out, their sails striped in colors you have not seen before. You are arriving somewhere. Now let us be still for a moment, floating gently on the water of that outermost ring, and look around at what Plato described. The rings of the city alternate. A ring of land, then a ring of water, then a ring of land, then a ring of water, each ring inside the previous one, growing smaller and more refined as they approach the center. The land rings are covered in buildings, not crowded, not chaotic, but arranged with a sense of space and proportion. There are colonnaded walkways and gardens between the buildings, and on the walls between one ring and the next, you can see the glint of metal. Plato described the walls as covered in different metals, each one more precious than the last as you moved toward the center. The outermost wall was covered in brass, the next in tin. The innermost wall of all, surrounding that central hill at the very heart of the city, was covered in something called orichalcum. Plato described this material as second in preciousness only to gold, as something that glowed with a warm reddish light, like copper but more brilliant, like fire caught in metal. No one today is entirely sure what orichalcum was. Some scholars think it may have been a brass alloy, or perhaps an especially pure form of copper, or perhaps simply a poetic name for something extraordinary. But whatever it was, Plato described it as covering the innermost wall so completely that from a distance, the heart of the city seemed to glow. At the center of everything, on that innermost hill, were two temples. The largest was dedicated to Poseidon, god of the sea, appropriate, because it was Poseidon who was said to have first shaped this island and given it to the woman he loved. The temple was one stade long, about 185 meters, its exterior plated with silver, its pinnacles of gold. Inside, Plato wrote, the roof was ivory with inlays of gold and silver and orichalcum. At the center of the interior stood a great gold statue of Poseidon himself, so tall that his head nearly touched the ceiling, driving a chariot of 6-winged horses, surrounded by 100 nereids, sea nymphs, riding on dolphins. The second temple was smaller and open to the sky, dedicated to the first royal couple of Atlantis, Poseidon and Cleito, the mortal woman he had loved and made his queen. Around these temples were gardens and fountains and bathing houses, both open and sheltered, and great exercise grounds, and the palace of the kings, which was expanded and embellished by each generation so that it had become, over centuries, a kind of encyclopedia in stone and metal of everything the civilization had ever learned to make beautiful. You might be wondering, softly, quietly, how all of this came to be. And that is a question that has a very old answer, told in the kind of language that people used when they wanted to explain the origins of extraordinary things. At the beginning, in the version Plato heard, passed down from Egyptian priests through the Athenian statesman Solon to Plato's own relative, and then to Plato himself. This island was given to Poseidon as his portion when the gods divided the world among themselves. And on this island, Poseidon found a woman he loved. Her name was Cleito. She lived on a low hill in the middle of the island with her mother and father. Her father was a man of the earth, one of the first people to spring from the soil of this island, in the old mythological sense of that phrase. And when her parents died, Cleito was left alone on her hill, and it was then that Poseidon came to her. He loved her, and because he was a god of the sea and of the earth's deep water, he shaped the land around her home to protect it and to honor his love for her. He carved the hill into a series of concentric rings, alternating rings of land and water, so that the place where Cleito lived was surrounded, moated, protected by the sea god's own power. No ordinary person could reach the center of those rings without Poseidon's consent, because the channels between the water rings could only be navigated by those he permitted. Cleito bore Poseidon 5 sets of twin sons, and these 10 sons were the first kings of Atlantis. The eldest was Atlas, from whom the island took its name, and from whom the surrounding ocean, the Atlantic, also takes its name. Each son was given a portion of the island to rule, and they all owed their allegiance to Atlas, who ruled from the central hill where his mother had lived and where his father had first shaped the concentric rings. And so the civilization began, not in a single dramatic moment, but slowly, generationally, the way all real civilizations begin, with people waking up each morning and doing the next necessary thing, and then the next, and then the next, until one day their grandchildren's grandchildren find themselves living in something that deserves to be called a city, and then a kingdom. And then, one quiet morning, when no one was particularly paying attention, an empire. Let us breathe here for a moment. Notice the sound of your own breathing. Notice how natural it is, how it continues without any effort on your part at all. In and out, in and out. Your body knows exactly what to do. Now, let us walk into the city, not with urgency, not with any particular destination. Let us simply walk in, the way a curious and unhurried traveler might, taking note of the small things, the ordinary things, the things that no history book ever bothers to record, because they seem too simple to be worth preserving. Let us notice the color of the stone. Let us notice the quality of the morning light. Let us notice the smell of bread baking somewhere, not far away. Let us go and find the people of Atlantis at the beginning of an ordinary day. Imagine waking up in a house in Atlantis. The first thing you would notice is the light. It comes in differently here than it does in most places because of the way the city is arranged and the way the walls and the water interact with the sun. The outer ring of water catches the early morning light and reflects it upward and inward, so that the city, even before the sun itself clears the mountains to the east, is already luminous. Not bright, exactly, more like gently illuminated, as though the light is arriving from multiple directions at once, softly, without any single harsh source. The houses in the inner rings of the city are made of stone, the local stone of the island, which comes in 3 colors. Plato mentions this specifically: white stone, black stone, and red stone, quarried from the hills and used in combination so that the buildings have a natural, variegated beauty without any need for paint or decoration. Imagine a wall made of alternating courses of white and red stone, with occasional black stones set in patterns like dark inlay. In the early morning light, these stones take on a warmth that they lose in the midday sun. They glow softly, amber and rose, and the pale gray of dawn. You are lying on a sleeping mat, a thick, well-padded mat of woven grasses and wool, elevated slightly on a low wooden frame. The frame is simple, clean-lined, practical. Above you, the ceiling is low beams of cedar wood. The mountains produce excellent timber, and between the beams, a thin plaster that has been smoothed and whitened and sometimes painted with simple decorations, a geometric border of dark blue and white, or a small scene of dolphins, or a repeating pattern of sea waves. The room is cool, not cold, but pleasantly cool, the way a well-built stone house is always cool in the morning before the day's heat has built. There is a single narrow window set high in the wall, and through it comes a thin bar of the early light, still golden, still low, and with it, a breath of air that carries the smell of the sea, and more faintly, the smell of flowers from the garden on the other side of the wall. You lie still for a moment. There is no urgency. The city is waking up around you, but it does so gently. There are distant sounds, the soft clop of an animal's hooves on stone somewhere, the murmur of voices from a neighboring house, the faint sound of water from one of the many channels that run through the city, carrying fresh water down from the springs in the mountains. None of these sounds are harsh or startling. They arrive like the light does, from multiple directions, softly, without insistence. When you rise, you do so slowly. The floor is cool stone beneath your feet, smooth from years of use, worn gently concave by the passage of feet across its surface. You reach for the first layer of your clothing, which was folded and set at the foot of your sleeping mat the night before. A simple linen undergarment, white, almost luminously white in the morning light. The linen here is very fine. The island grows its own flax along the banks of the rivers that cross the Great Plain, and over generations, the people have learned to produce a linen of unusual quality, thin enough to breathe in the heat of the day, dense enough to carry embroidery. At the hem and cuffs, there is a small basin of water in the corner of the room. You move to it and splash water on your face, cold and completely clear, coming from the spring system that feeds water through channels into each dwelling. You dry your face with a small square of rough cloth hanging on a peg beside the basin. You run your wet hands through your hair, smoothing it. There is a bronze mirror on a stand beside the basin, small and round, its surface polished to a soft reflectiveness. It shows you a blurry, warm version of your own face. You look at it for a moment, not critically, just in the mild and half-asleep way that people look at themselves in mirrors first thing in the morning. Then you look away. You dress. Over the linen undergarment you put a longer outer garment, loosely draped, belted at the waist with a woven cord, its hem reaching to your knees or just below. The cloth is a warm off-white, the color of unbleached wool, with a narrow band of embroidered decoration along the hem in deep blue and rust red. Simple, practical, comfortable. Your sandals are by the door. You bend to put them on. Leather soles, leather straps, worn and shaped to your feet by years of use. They are not beautiful sandals, exactly, but they are good ones, the kind that carry you through a full day without complaint. The first room you enter after your sleeping room is the main room of the house, a single large space that serves as both a living area and a place for the morning meal. The floor here is the same smooth stone, but there are mats and cushions arranged around a low table, and the walls have more light coming in. Two larger windows face the small interior courtyard, and through them comes the sound and light of the morning. More fully, someone is already up. In a household like this one, and we might imagine a household of perhaps 5 or 6 people, an extended family in the way common to the ancient world, there is almost always someone who rises before everyone else. This morning it is a woman of middle years, perhaps 40, moving efficiently but without haste between the main room and the small cooking alcove at the back of the house. She has already been to the communal water point and brought back fresh water for the day. She is now arranging food for the morning meal, and the smell of it, warm bread, a particular kind of flat bread made from the island's own grain, baked on a smooth hot stone, is what has drawn you from your sleeping room. She looks up when you appear. She says something in greeting. The language of Atlantis is unknown to us, will always be unknown to us, so we can only imagine its sound. Perhaps it is something like the ancient Greek that Plato wrote in, musical, with rising and falling tones, with vowels that are held slightly longer than you expect. Perhaps it is something entirely different, something that existed before the languages we know, something that is now as lost as the island itself. But whatever the words, the tone is warm and familiar, the greeting of someone to someone they have seen every morning for years and years, and are glad to see again. Sit down at the low table. The cushion beneath you is thick and soft, filled with wool, covered in a coarse linen dyed a faded blue. The table is just above knee height, made of dark wood, its surface worn smooth. There is already a clay cup on the table, and the woman pours into it from a small pitcher water, cool and clean, or perhaps a diluted wine, the thin, slightly sour morning drink that people in the ancient Mediterranean world often preferred to begin the day. The bread comes next. It is placed on the table in a flat round, still warm from the stone, giving off a faint steam. It is made from emmer wheat, a variety that has been cultivated here for generations, adapted to the island's particular soil, and it has a slightly nutty, golden flavor, denser than modern bread, satisfying in a way that makes you want to eat it slowly. There is olive oil in a small clay bowl beside it. The island grows olives on the lower slopes of the mountains, in long, gentle groves, and you dip the bread into the oil and eat it in small, unhurried bites. There might also be olives themselves, the black ones, cured in brine and preserved in clay jars, and a piece of hard, dry cheese from the goats that graze on the hillsides, perhaps dried figs, sweet and slightly gummy, each one containing in its concentrated sweetness the whole warm memory of the summer. Perhaps a small amount of honey in a little clay pot, its surface filmed with a crystalline crust that dissolves slowly when you touch it with the tip of your bread. The morning meal is not elaborate. No one in Atlantis, however wealthy, makes the morning meal a complicated thing. That is for the later meal, the main meal of the day, which will come in the afternoon after the heat has peaked and begun to decline. This morning meal is simpler: bread and oil, and something salty, and something sweet, eaten quietly, the body receiving what it needs after the long fast of sleep. The others come to the table one by one. A young man, perhaps 16 or 17, still heavy-lidded with sleep, folding himself onto a cushion and reaching wordlessly for bread. A child, younger, maybe 8 or 9, who says something in a quick, bright voice and is answered by the woman with a word of gentle correction. An older man, the grandfather, perhaps, or an elder uncle, who lowers himself to his cushion more carefully, his joints making him deliberate in his movements, and who greets everyone with a murmured word before attending to his cup with both hands. Outside, through the courtyard windows, you can see the quality of the morning light changing. The gold of the very early hours is fading now into the cleaner, whiter light of mid-morning. Birds are moving through the courtyard, small brown sparrows, mostly hopping along the edges of the stone pavement, investigating the ground with quick tilts of their heads. A cat is sitting on the top of the courtyard wall, entirely still, watching the birds with the patient, focused inattention of a cat that is not actually planning to do anything. This is the morning in Atlantis. This is the beginning of an ordinary day. After the morning meal, the day opens up. The streets of the inner rings of the city are not wide. They are the width of 2 carts, perhaps, or 3 people walking abreast, but they are well maintained. The stone paving is kept clean by the people who live along each street, a sense of collective responsibility for the shared space. At intervals along the streets, there are small public fountains fed by the same spring water system that serves the private houses. Their basins always full of cold, clear water that spills over the rim in a thin, continuous sheet and drains away through channels in the stone. People stop at these fountains to drink, to refill a clay jug, to splash their hands and faces on a warm morning. The buildings along the inner streets are mostly 2 stories high, though here and there a taller structure rises, a temple, a civic building, a wealthy family's house. The upper stories often have wooden balconies overlooking the street, and from these balconies, on a fine morning, you might see garments hung to air in the breeze, or small pots of herbs arranged in the sunlight, or an old person sitting in a chair watching the street below with the quiet, comfortable attention of someone who has nowhere particular to be and is entirely content with this fact. Let us walk now. Let us move through the street slowly, the way someone walks when they are not late for anything, when they have given themselves enough time to simply be in the place they are. The smell of the city in the morning is a layered thing. At the base of it is always the sea, that cool, mineral, slightly briny smell that pervades everything within sight of salt water. Over that is the smell of the channels themselves, the fresh water that runs through the rings of the city, which has a clean, almost sweet smell, particularly where it passes through stone that has been colonized by moss and small ferns. Over that, in the morning, is wood smoke from cooking fires, a thin blue haze that lies very low to the ground on still days. And over all of that, in the season when they are blooming, is the smell of flowers, particularly from the gardens that are incorporated into most of the city blocks, small green spaces that break up the stone and give the city a breathing, living quality. The markets are beginning to open. The main market of each ring is a broad open square, not unlike the Agora in Athens, but perhaps more deliberately beautiful. The buildings around it are better matched in height and proportion, the paving underfoot more carefully maintained. In the early morning, the stall holders are arriving, carrying their goods in on wooden carts pulled by small, sturdy horses, or on their backs in woven baskets, or balanced on their heads in the way of people who have carried things on their heads since they were children. Let us stop and look at what they are selling. Here is a stall with pottery, the pottery of Atlantis, and this is something we might reasonably imagine, given the traditions of other island civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean, would be distinctive. Not the same as Greek pottery, not the same as Egyptian, something that has developed its own character over generations. Perhaps the shapes are somewhat similar to what we know from other ancient civilizations. Wide-mouthed storage jars, elegant narrow-necked amphorae for wine and oil, flat dishes for food, cups of various sizes, but the decoration is its own. Spirals, very often. The spiral is an island motif found on the cultures of Minoan Crete and ancient Malta, and the other island civilizations we actually know about. And it seems right that it should belong to Atlantis as well. Spirals that suggest both the coiling of waves and the coiling of shells, both the rotation of the heavens and the unfolding of a fern frond, deep blue and rust red on a warm cream ground. The potter, a person of perhaps 35, hands permanently stained with clay, nails always with a thin dark line beneath them, is arranging the goods on low wooden shelves. Each piece is placed with care, turned slightly to show its best profile. There is a pleasure in this arranging. You can see it. The quiet satisfaction of putting things in their proper place. Here, further along, is a stall selling fresh fish. The fishermen have been out since before dawn in the small boats that crowd the outer harbor, and now they have returned with their catch. The fish are laid out on a slab of smooth stone that has been kept cool somehow, perhaps by the shadow of the building behind it, or perhaps by cold water from the channel poured over it in the early morning. They are beautiful in the way that fresh fish are beautiful, silvery and bright-eyed, their scales still iridescent in the morning light. There are many varieties. This is an island with access to deep Atlantic waters, as well as the shallower waters of the inner channels. And the fishermen know all of the varieties and all of their habits. There are large silver fish that belong to the open ocean. There are smaller, darker fish from the channel waters. There are what appear to be a kind of mullet, and something resembling sea bass, and a large flat creature that lies at the bottom of the stall, looking more like an abstract sculpture than a food item. There are also shellfish, mussels in their dark hinged shells, clams, a heap of small sea urchins whose open tops reveal the bright orange roe inside. The fisherman is talking to a woman who has stopped at the stall, gesturing at one of the larger fish and then at a smaller one, indicating some quality of freshness or flavor with an expressive tilt of his hand. She listens, looks at the fish, looks at him, looks at the fish again. She's not in a hurry. Neither is he. The transaction is going to take the time it takes. Further along, a bread stall, different from the flat bread of the morning. These are larger, round loaves for the main meal, made with more leavening, slightly spongier, with a dark scored crust. Beside the bread are small sweet cakes, the kind that appear at every kind of celebration, and also appear at no celebration at all, simply because people like sweet things in the morning. They are made with honey and ground nuts and dried fruit, dense and sticky and very sweet, wrapped in fresh leaves to keep them from adhering to everything around them. A grain stall, a stall selling honey, the jars arranged by color from pale gold to deep amber. A stall selling woven cloth, bolts of linen and wool in natural colors and dyed colors, the dyed ones in the particular shades that the island's plant dyes produce. A soft yellow from one plant, a dusty blue from another, a deep rust red from yet another. And here, at the corner of the market square, a very ordinary thing that you might almost miss if you were not paying attention. An old woman sitting on a low stone step, selling nothing, buying nothing, simply sitting in the morning sun with her eyes half closed, her face turned toward the warmth. She has been in this city her whole life. She has sat on this step, or on steps very like it, since she was young enough that sitting on steps was an adventure rather than a rest. The city has changed around her, slowly, in the way cities always slowly change. New buildings have gone up, old ones have been taken down and rebuilt. The faces in the market have changed as old families dwindled and new ones grew. But the quality of the morning light on stone, that has not changed. The smell of bread from the stall a few meters away, that has not changed. The sound of the water in the channel, running its patient course from the mountain springs to the sea, that has not changed. She sits in the sun. She breathes. She has nowhere to be. Let us breathe here for a moment too. Feel the sun, if you can imagine it, a warmth that is neither too hot nor too mild, a Mediterranean kind of sun that sits on the skin like a gentle pressure, like a hand resting on your shoulder. Let it rest there for a moment. Let it be pleasant. Most of the people of Atlantis do not live in the city. They live on the Great Plain, in villages and farmsteads scattered across that vast flat expanse of fertile land that stretches from the mountains to the sea. Let us visit one of these places. Let us travel out from the city through the Great Channel and then along one of the roads that cross the plain. Straight roads. Plato described them. Impressively straight, cutting across the plain with a kind of deliberate geometry that suggests a culture comfortable with planning, comfortable with the idea that the landscape can be shaped to suit human purposes. The roads are paved in the same three-colored stone as the city, white and black and red, laid in broad flat sections, and along each side of the road runs a drainage channel, well made and well maintained. Every so often there is a resting place, a stone bench in the shade of a tree, a public water trough for animals, a small shrine with a carved figure, and a place to leave an offering. The plain itself is extraordinary. Plato described it as the most fertile land in the world, and you can see why. The soil is dark, almost black in places, heavy with the kind of richness that belongs to volcanic land and to river deltas, to places where the earth has been fed and fed and fed for so long that it almost seems to glow from underneath. The crops here grow with an easiness that farmers elsewhere would find astonishing. The grain tall and heavy-headed, the olive trees gnarled and old, and productive beyond what any planted tree has a right to be, the fruit trees so loaded in their season that the branches have to be propped with wooden supports to keep them from breaking. Imagine walking along the road in the early morning, the city a few hours behind you, the mountains ahead of you shimmering faintly in the early heat. On either side of the road, the fields are spread out flat and wide. At this hour, and it is perhaps mid-morning now, the sun well up, but not yet at its height. There are people working in the fields. They work in groups, mostly. This is not a civilization of isolated, individual farmers working their own small plots. It is a civilization of communal labor, of families and neighborhoods working together, of the accumulated knowledge of generations passed down in the way of doing things. There might be 20 people in a field, moving through the grain with the long curved blades of their harvest tools, the blades catching the light as they swing, the grain falling in even sheaves. There is talking and occasional laughter from across the field, the kind of background sound that belongs to people who have worked together for so long that the work itself has become a form of companionship. At the edge of the field, in the shade of a large tree, several children are sitting together, the children too young to help with the heavy work, left in the shade while the adults work. They are occupied with their own small universe, a game involving stones and a scratched line in the dirt, an argument that flares briefly and is forgotten, a period of looking at something in the grass, An insect, perhaps, or a small lizard, with the pure absorbed attention that children bring to small things. A farmhouse on the edge of the plain, low, solid, built of the same three-colored stone as the city buildings, but without the city's refinement. The stones here are less perfectly dressed, the mortar between them rougher, the proportions more practical and less beautiful. But it is a good house. It has been here a long time, and it will be here for a long time more. The roof is of terracotta tiles, slightly orange in color, some of them replaced at different times, so that the surface of the roof is a patchwork of old dark and new bright. At one end of the building, a lean-to animal shelter, a donkey and 2 goats visible inside in the shade. The donkey asleep on its feet in the way donkeys sleep. The yard in front of the farmhouse is packed earth, hard and dust dry in the dry season, reddish mud in the wet. A large clay storage jar stands against the wall of the house, its shoulder reaching to a person's waist, sealed with a clay cap that has been tamped with beeswax. Inside would be grain, enough, if things go well, to see the household through to the next harvest. This jar is the household's security. It is treated accordingly, with a kind of respect that is not quite religious, but is close to it. Near the storage jar, a smaller jar of olive oil. Near that, a clay pot sealed with a cloth containing dried herbs, thyme and oregano, and something sharper, more medicinal, that the grandmother knows the uses of. A bunch of dried onions hanging from a nail, a rope coil, a broken harness waiting to be mended. Everything in the yard has its place. Nothing is wasted. In a household that grows what it eats and makes what it uses, nothing can be wasted. And the habit of economy, of careful, attentive use of everything, becomes a way of seeing the world as much as a way of managing resources. Inside the farmhouse it is cool and slightly dim. The windows are small. Windows are a compromise between light and heat in a warm climate, and in a house without glass. Making windows larger means making the house hotter in summer and colder in winter. So the windows are narrow, set high in the walls, and the light inside has the particular quality of filtered, bounced light. Soft, sourceless, even. The main room of the farmhouse is large and simple. A hearth at one end, cold now in the middle of the warm season, surrounded by smooth stones. The smoke from the fire goes up through a hole in the ceiling above it. Not perfect ventilation. There is a slight smell of old smoke in the room, the way old churches sometimes smell of incense, even when no incense has been burned for months. Soot has darkened the ceiling above the hearth in a spreading circle. Around the walls, low wooden benches serve as both seating and as platforms for the rolled sleeping mats that are stored there during the day. A wooden rack holds tools, a hand mill for grinding grain, several clay vessels of different sizes, a large basket, a wooden peg with garments hanging from it. On a small wooden shelf near the door, a carved figure, a small clay lamp, a dried flower, a smooth pebble of an unusual color, a simple household shrine. This is where the family comes together at the end of the day. This is where the stories are told, and the decisions are made, and the arguments are settled, and the children are made to go to sleep when they would rather stay up. This is the room that holds, in its walls, and its smells, and its worn surfaces, the entire texture of the family's life. Let us breathe slowly, and let that image settle. A room that holds a family's life. How simple and how full such a room can be when you really look at it. All the invisible weight of all the ordinary days pressed into the smoothness of a worn bench, carried in the grain of a wooden shelf. Water is at the heart of Atlantis in a way that is both literal and symbolic. Literally, the city is defined by its rings of water. The plain is crossed by channels that bring the mountain springs down to the fields and then to the sea. The outer harbor is one of the greatest gathering places in the civilization, where ships from many different places come and go continuously. The island itself is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, which provides both the city's most important resource, fish, and its most important connection, trade. But also symbolically, Atlantis was founded by the god of the sea. Its people understood themselves, in some deep way, as a sea people, even those who lived on the plain and farmed and rarely saw the ocean except on their way to the city. The sea is present in their mythology, in their art, in the decorations on their pottery, in the names they give their children. The spiral, that omnipresent motif, is always, in the end, the shape of a wave, or the shape of a shell, or the shape of the water pulled into a slow vortex where two currents meet. Let us go down to the harbor. The outer harbor of Atlantis is, according to Plato, an enormous circular basin, the outermost of all the rings of water surrounding the city. It is the working harbor, the commercial harbor, the place where the real life of an island economy is most visibly enacted. Ships come here from distant places, from the coast of what we would now call Morocco and Algeria and Spain, from the islands of the Western Mediterranean, perhaps from places that would later be known as the Azores or the Canaries, if those islands were in fact inhabited at this time, which remains an open question. Perhaps even from further, from the coasts of the vast western continent that the Atlanteans, according to Plato, had explored and partially colonized. Coming down to the harbor in the late morning, you walk through the commercial district that has naturally accumulated around it. Warehouses for storing goods, workshops for repairing ships and making the things that ships need, counting houses where merchants and their agents sit with clay tablets and do the complex arithmetic of trade. Wine shops and eating houses catering to sailors and merchants, and the people who work with them. The sounds down here are different from the sounds of the residential streets. There is more noise, more variety of voices, different languages mixing in the particular music of a cosmopolitan port. The sound of a trading civilization that has made itself comfortable with variety. There is the creak of rope and the groan of wood as ships move against their moorings. There is the constant background of water, the wavelets of the harbor basin, the drip of rope ends, the splash of someone unloading goods from a smaller boat. The smell here is richer and more complex than elsewhere in the city. Salt water and tar, and the particular sharp smell of fish being unloaded and cleaned at the quayside. Over that, the smell of wine from an open amphora, sweet and slightly fermented. And under all of it, the smell of the sea itself, that deep, clean, mineral smell that belongs to large bodies of open salt water. And that is unlike any other smell in the world. Let us sit for a moment on the stone edge of the quay and watch the harbor. It is busy, but not frantic. Ships are moving in and out through the great channel that connects the harbor to the open sea. You can see the mouth of the channel from here, a wide opening in the outermost wall. The daylight beyond it, a brighter blue-white than the daylight inside. The harbor. A large ship is coming in now. A broad-beamed cargo vessel, its single sail being furled by sailors moving along a spar. The oarsman on the lower deck pulling steadily to bring the ship to its mooring. It is loaded deeply, riding low in the water, the cargo packed in the hold and secured on deck under woven covers. What has it brought? It might be timber from a forested coast to the north. It might be copper ingots from the mines of Cyprus or Sardinia. It might be grain from a fertile coast, or fine pottery, or dried fruit, or cloth, or slaves. The ancient Mediterranean trade was in all of these things, and in 100 others. There are smaller vessels too, narrow fishing boats returning with the morning's catch, their hulls painted in bright colors, blue and red, and a startling ochre yellow, that serve the practical purpose of identification at sea and the aesthetic purpose of making the harbor, as seen from any distance, a cheerful and colorful place. There are ferries too, small open boats that carry people and light goods across the harbor or between the rings of the inner city, where the channels are too narrow and too shallow for larger vessels. The quayside itself is busy. Porters carrying loads on their backs or balanced on carrying poles between two people. Merchants standing over newly unloaded goods, checking lists on clay tablets, arguing in 2 or 3 languages at once. Sailors taking a break from unloading, sitting on bollards and eating something from a folded leaf, a piece of flatbread wrapped around some filling. The ancient world's traveling food. Customs officials moving from ship to ship with their own tablets, assessing and recording and collecting the taxes that fund the city's maintenance. And here and there, at the edges of the activity, people who are not working. A group of children who have escaped supervision and are dangling their feet off the edge of the quay and watching the water with complete absorption, debating something in quick, low voices, probably about jumping in. An old sailor, retired from the sea now, but unable to stay away from it entirely, sitting on a coil of rope and watching the ships with the deep, unhurried attention of someone who knows everything that is happening and feels no need to be involved in any of it. A woman selling food from a small portable stand, cakes of some kind, fried in oil, calling out to passersby in a voice that is strong without being shrill, the practiced voice of someone who has been selling things from this spot for many years. The sea beyond the harbor mouth. Even from here, you can see it. The Atlantic Ocean, stretching out to the horizon in every direction, enormous and calm on a day like this, its surface a deep, slightly greenish-blue broken by the soft white lines of slow swells moving through. There is no land visible anywhere on the horizon. The ocean goes on and on, all the way to the edge of the world. In Plato's time, no one knew what was on the other side of this ocean. The Greeks and the Egyptians knew about the Mediterranean world, They knew about the coasts of Africa and Asia. They knew about the islands of the inner sea. But the Atlantic was another matter. It was vast and unknown, and its vastness had a particular psychological quality. It was the place beyond which anything might exist, or nothing. It was the place where the known world dissolved into possibility. For the people of Atlantis, who lived in this ocean, who were entirely surrounded by it, who had sailed on it for generations, for them it must have had a different quality. Not the unknown, exactly, not the frightening edge of the world, more like a home that is very large, larger than you can fully know, but home nonetheless. The horizon is not a wall for them. It is an invitation. Plato described the early Atlanteans as a remarkable people, not because they were different from all other people. In their daily needs and their daily pleasures, they were quite recognizably human, but because of the particular character that their civilization had developed, and because of what that character became over time. In the beginning, according to Plato, the descendants of Poseidon and Cleito were, and this is his word, virtuous. They governed their island wisely and justly, taking what they needed from the island's abundance without excess, treating each other fairly, honoring the divine compact that had made them what they were. They were wealthy by any measure. The island gave them everything: grain and timber and metal, fruit and fish, and the fresh water of the mountain springs. Their trade brought them more. Over generations, the inherited wealth of the civilization accumulated, not through hoarding, exactly, but through the natural multiplication of competently managed resources over centuries. The harbor grew larger. The roads on the plain grew straighter and better maintained. The temples were embellished. The palace was expanded. The channels were widened and deepened. But in the midst of all this growing richness, the people themselves, at least in the beginning, in the generations closest to the divine founding, remained, Plato says, moderate. They were happy to have what they had. They did not strain after more than they needed. They were, in the ancient Greek sense of the word, temperate. They understood that the right relationship with pleasure and with wealth was to enjoy them without being governed by them. This is the quality that Plato most valued, and it is the quality whose eventual disappearance from Atlantis he most mourned. But we are not yet at the morning. We are in the beginning, when the morning is still fresh and the day has not yet turned. What did the people of Atlantis look like? We do not know, of course. Plato does not describe them physically, but we can make some reasonable inferences from geography and from what we know about the physical appearance of the peoples of the ancient Atlantic coast. They were probably, if they had indeed had the origins Plato described, a divine father who was both sea and earth, a mortal mother from an island that had sprung from the earth, a mixed people, people whose deep ancestry went back to the original inhabitants of the island, before the god came, before the 10 suns, before the empire, people whose skin tones span the range common to the peoples of the ancient Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds, from the very dark of North Africa to the somewhat lighter shades of southern Europe, with every gradation between. In their clothing, we might imagine something recognizable to anyone who has studied the ancient Mediterranean world. The basic garment of draped linen or wool, simply constructed, Versatile, worn differently by different people according to rank and season and occasion. In the city, among the wealthier citizens, the cloth might be finer and the decoration more elaborate, embroidery in deep colors, a few pieces of jewelry, perhaps a bronze pin or a string of polished stones. On the plain, among the farmers and the fishermen, the clothing is more practical and less decorated, worn longer, patched and repaired until it falls apart. Their hair is worn long, mostly, both men and women, and either loose or braided or coiled in various ways. Jewelry is present, but not excessive. A few bronze or copper items, a string of shells or polished stones, a single earring of hammered metal. The aesthetic is not maximalist. Things are done carefully, but not elaborately. There is a preference for quality over quantity, for the well-made thing over the showily decorated thing. Imagine now a family gathered in the courtyard of a house in one of the middle rings of the city in the late morning before the main meal. The courtyard is small, perhaps 10 meters square, but it is full of life. There is a fig tree in one corner, old enough that its trunk is thicker than a person's thigh, its branches spreading out to cover most of the courtyard in dappled shade. Under this tree, a woman is weaving. The loom is a simple, upright one, its warped threads hanging from a horizontal bar, the heddle just a bundle of wooden sticks. The cloth she is making is a plain weave in a warm cream color, intended for a practical garment. Her hands move through the warp with a rhythmic, automated sureness that speaks of years of practice. She does not look at what she is doing. She talks instead with the older woman sitting nearby on a low stool, who is doing something with her hands too, sorting and spinning a small pile of raw wool. Two men sit on the low wall that runs along one side of the courtyard, apparently doing nothing, which means they are probably in conversation, talking about something that requires no movement, only attention. A dog is stretched out in the one patch of full sun in the courtyard, completely flattened by the warmth, its eyes half closed, its tail occasionally swishing at a fly. The sounds of the street are audible over the courtyard wall. Footsteps, voices, the distant sound of the harbor, but muffled, domestic, the sounds of outside life heard from a safe interior distance. The courtyard is a room that happens to have no roof, and it has the quality of a room, sheltered, personal, belonging to the family in a way that the public street does not. The children of this household are somewhere else at the moment. They may be at school, because the Atlanteans, as Plato imagined them, would certainly have had some kind of formal education, given the level of their civilization. Or they may be somewhere in the neighborhood, in the loosely supervised freedom that ancient urban children generally enjoyed, old enough to navigate the streets alone, young enough that the streets themselves are still an adventure. What did children in Atlantis learn? We can imagine something similar to what we know of education in other ancient cultures. Language and number, first, in some form. The ability to read and write. If this civilization had writing, which, given its trading connections and its administrative complexity, it almost certainly did. A script of its own, perhaps, though any such script has left no surviving trace. Or perhaps a script related to the proto-writing systems that archaeology has found in various parts of the ancient world, the kind of symbolic notation that lives on the edge between image and letter. Beyond literacy, children would learn the practical things: how to sail a boat, if they were a harbor family; how to care for animals and tend a field, if they were farm children; how to work the loom, if they were in a weaving family. The practical education of the ancient world was largely a matter of watching those who were skilled, and then slowly, carefully, with a great deal of patient correction, beginning to do it yourself. Let us pause here, in this courtyard, under the fig tree. The woman weaving has reached the end of a row and is adjusting the threads with careful fingers. The older woman is spinning, her spindle turning slowly, the thread extending from her hands with a steadiness that seems almost impossible to maintain, but that, for her, is simply the way the hands have always moved. The men on the wall are talking quietly. The dog has given up on consciousness entirely and has gone deeply to sleep. The fig tree drops a single leaf. It turns as it falls, catching the light twice, and then settles softly on the courtyard floor. There is no urgency anywhere. In the middle of the afternoon, when the heat has peaked and the light has that heavy, golden quality that belongs to the hours between noon and 3, the working day in Atlantis pauses. This is not laziness. It is good sense, the kind of ecological wisdom that belongs to peoples who live in warm climates and have worked out, over many generations, the optimum relationship between human energy and the arc of the sun. In the hottest part of the day, you stop, you find shade, you eat, you perhaps sleep for a short while, and then, in the cooler hours of the later afternoon and evening, you resume. The main meal of the day is taken at this pause. It is not eaten in a hurry. It is eaten in the proper way of important things, with attention, with company, with the kind of leisurely conversation that food shared with others naturally occasions. Let us imagine the meal as it might be prepared in a household in the inner rings of the city, not a wealthy household, not a poor one, but an ordinary, comfortable one, the kind that makes up the vast majority of any civilization. The cooking has been happening since late morning. The main cooking fire. Most houses have a small outdoor hearth in the courtyard, used during the warm months to avoid heating the interior, was lit an hour after the morning meal, and since then a clay pot has been sitting over it, its contents slowly transforming through the long alchemy of low heat. What is in the pot? Plato, in his description of Atlantis, mentions the extraordinary abundance of the island's food supply. He lists, specifically, and with evident pleasure, wheat and barley, all kinds of pulse, timber, herbs both fragrant and culinary, grapes, olives, fruit trees of every kind, chestnuts. He mentions cultivated plants and wild plants both. He mentions the animals, cattle and horses and goats and pigs and elephants. Yes, elephants, which suggests that the large land mass associated with Atlantis was tropical or semi-tropical in its southern portions, or that the description carries the kind of exaggeration that belongs to myth. But working from what we know about the food of ancient Mediterranean and Atlantic civilizations, the pot on the fire might contain lentils, dark and earthy, soften now after long cooking into a thick, fragrant mass, cooked with olive oil and garlic and the dried herbs from the shelf near the door. Thyme, mostly, and a little oregano, and perhaps a bone that one of the children was sent to the market to get, which has given the lentils a slight meaty depth without being the point of the dish. The lentils are the point. They are substantial and nourishing, and, at this point in their cooking, they smell extraordinary. Beside the pot, wrapped in damp cloth on the edge of the hearth, where they can stay warm, several large, flat loaves, made with more leavening than the morning bread, their surfaces scored in a cross pattern and slightly burnished where they have been brushed with oil before baking. Each loaf is substantial, meant for several people, and the bread is good. The crust gives way with a satisfying sound, and the interior is dense and slightly chewy, the kind of bread that works well for scooping up soft food from a bowl. There will also be, because this is an island, because the market was visited this morning, because the household takes its eating seriously, fish. Grilled fish, cooked on the small clay grill that sits beside the main hearth. A large, silver-skinned fish scored diagonally several times so the heat can penetrate, rubbed with salt and oil and a paste of garlic and dried herbs, laid on the grill and left to cook slowly, turned once with 2 flat sticks, taken off when the skin is just beginning to char at the edges and the flesh has gone from translucent to white and flaky. A bowl of olives, a plate of whatever fresh vegetables the season offers in the summer, cucumbers sliced thin, dressed with a little vinegar, a few tomato-like things, or perhaps early figs still slightly warm from the sun, a bunch of herbs, the small fresh leaves of something aromatic, eaten as a salad. In winter, the same bowl might hold roasted root vegetables, or a kind of preserved cabbage, or the dried figs and dates that travel well and can be kept through any season. Honey for sweetness at the end, and something to drink, probably the local wine, diluted with water in the ancient fashion, light enough to drink through a long meal without any effect except good cheer, served in plain clay cups whose rims have been worn smooth by years of being brought to lips. The family gathers. They arrange themselves around the low table, on cushions, on rolled mats, on the low wooden benches that double as seats. The oldest person present is served first, always. This is a form of respect so deeply embedded in the culture that it is not even consciously observed. It simply happens, the way breathing happens, without thought. The conversation is general and easy. How was the morning? The child who was sent to the market with a list reports what the market was like, who was there, what was being sold, what was unusual. Someone mentions something that happened in the street. Someone else mentions a neighbor's illness and is met with an expression of concern. A disagreement from earlier in the morning is raised again, considered, and either resolved or set aside. The conversation is not about large things, mostly. It is about the texture of the day, the small things that happened, the small plans that are being made, the small worries, and the small pleasures. This is the conversation of the main meal. It is not spectacular. It does not require recording. It has been happening in households like this one, all over the world, for as long as people have been cooking food and sitting together to eat it. It will continue to happen long after all of this. This city, this civilization, this island is gone. The meal is eaten slowly. There is no reason to hurry. The food is good, deeply satisfying in the way that simple food prepared well always is. The kind of food that fills the body without burdening it, that warms from the inside without overheating, that provides exactly what is needed and exactly what is pleasant at the same time. After the food, the honey, a small amount, spooned from the jar onto a piece of bread, eaten in slow bites, the sweetness spreading on the tongue and then fading. And then the cups are set down, and the conversation slows, and the afternoon has arrived properly now, heavy with heat and food, and the natural inclination of a well-fed body toward rest. The dog, which has been positioned near the table at a respectful but optimistic distance throughout the meal, is finally given a piece of fish skin and retreats to its corner with an air of dignified satisfaction. Let us stay here for a moment. In this afternoon, in this warmth, in this pleasant heaviness after a good meal, let your body feel its own weight. Let your breathing slow further. This is the time of day for rest. And rest is not something to resist. It is something to accept graciously, the way you might accept a small, unexpected gift. The afternoon in Atlantis belongs to the body's need for rest. Not everywhere, not for everyone. The harbor never entirely rests. The ships come and go on their own schedules, and the tide waits for no one's afternoon nap. The marketplace is quieter, but not empty. There are always those whose work does not observe the pause of the hottest hours. But in the residential streets, in the farmsteads on the plain, in the houses of the craftsmen and the merchants and the ordinary working people, there is a hush. The midday streets are quiet. Shutters are drawn against the heat. Animals stand in whatever shade they can find, their eyes half closed, patient and still. Inside the houses, people sleep. It is one of the profound pleasures of human life, and it belongs particularly to the hot afternoon in a warm climate. The shallow, comfortable sleep that comes after the main meal. Not the deep unconsciousness of the night's sleep, but something lighter, more aware. You can still hear the sounds of the house and the street, but they are muffled, distant, pleasant rather than intrusive. The body is horizontal. The eyes are closed. The breath has slowed to the long rhythm of sleep. Thoughts drift without direction, the way clouds drift on a day with very little wind, moving, changing shape, but without any urgency, without going anywhere in particular. Some people do not sleep. They simply lie still, their eyes open or closed, looking at the ceiling or at the undersides of their own eyelids, thinking or not thinking, existing in that useful, restorative middle state between sleep and wakefulness that is perhaps more common in the ancient world than in our own. Some sit in the shade of a courtyard and do something with their hands, the repetitive work that the hands can do without any direction from the thinking mind. Spinning, as we have seen, or the slow, methodical work of mending, stitching a torn hem, replacing a broken sandal strap, repairing a basket that has lost a few strands. These tasks do not require thought. They allow the mind to wander and the body to rest even while the hands are moving. Let us wander a little in this quiet afternoon, walking slowly through the sleeping streets of the inner city, observing the city at rest. A street of artisans' workshops. During the morning, these were full of sound, the ring of hammer on metal, the scrape of a blade being sharpened, the distinctive rushing sound of a bellows feeding air to a fire. Now they are quiet. The shutters are down on most of the shop fronts. Here and there, a workshop door stands open, and through it you can see the interior. The tools hanging on the wall, the unfinished work on the bench, the floor scattered with the shavings, or the metal filings, or the clay dust of the morning's work. An economy of form that belongs to working spaces everywhere, in every era. Nothing decorative, everything functional. The beauty of the place being entirely in its purposefulness. In one doorway, a bronze worker is sitting on his threshold, awake but still, watching the street with the serene patience of someone who has decided that watching the street is a perfectly sufficient occupation for this hour. He is a man of perhaps 50, with the broad shoulders and the permanently reddened forearms of someone who has spent his life working close to heat. His hands are resting on his knees, very still for hands that are so obviously capable of complex and forceful movement. He looks up when you pass. There is no urgency in his look, no demand for explanation of your presence in his street. He simply observes you with the mild, unsurprised curiosity of a man who has sat on this threshold for 20 years and has watched many thousands of people walk past. You nod. He nods back. You continue walking. A small temple at the intersection of two streets. Not one of the great central temples. Those are on the innermost hill, behind the innermost wall, but one of the neighborhood shrines that are scattered throughout the city, dedicated to lesser divine figures, to ancestral spirits, to the particular protecting powers of this district. The temple is small, the size of a large room, really, and it is open at the front, without a door, so that anyone can approach at any time. Inside, in the soft dimness, there is a carved figure of something that may be a god or may be a spirit, its features simplified to the essential by generations of stylistic convention until they express the essence of divinity rather than anything recognizably human. Large eyes, a calm expression, hands at its sides, or extended toward the worshipper. Before the figure, on a low stone altar, small offerings. A bunch of dried flowers past their prime, their petals falling slightly. A small clay cup with a residue of dried wine. A piece of bread, placed there recently, today, perhaps this morning, and still fresh, beginning to dry in the afternoon warmth. A smooth stone, very white, placed with care at the edge of the altar. A stub of wax, the remnant of a lamp, its wick burned to nothing. These are not grand offerings. They are not the great public sacrifices of the state religion, the ceremonies presided over by priests in formal garments before crowds of assembled citizens. These are personal offerings, private. Someone passed this temple on their way somewhere and left what they had to leave, as they passed every day, as a way of acknowledging that the world is larger than they are, and that some portion of the day's good fortune belongs to something other than their own cleverness. You stand at the entrance to the temple for a moment. The air inside is cooler than the street. Old stone holds cold, and this stone is very old. There is a faint smell of incense, though no incense is burning now. The figure in the dimness looks at you with its large, calm, simplified eyes. You stand there. You breathe. Nothing is required of you. Further on, a public garden, one of several that break up the city's stone with green, giving the eye somewhere to rest that is not a wall or a paved surface. The garden is not elaborate. It is not the garden of a wealthy house, with its rare plants and its deliberate arrangements. It is a civic garden, planted and maintained by the neighborhood, with the slightly imprecise beauty of something that has grown into its space rather than been designed for it. Fruit trees, fig and pomegranate and olive, grow somewhat randomly, their branches interleaving overhead. Between them, herbs and low-growing flowers, some planted, some self-seeded, the kind of small yellow and blue flowers that belong to the edges of things in the Mediterranean world and will grow anywhere they find a crack to root in. There are stone benches here in the shade, and several are occupied. A young mother with a very small child, the child asleep against her shoulder. An old man reading, or appearing to read, from a set of clay tablets arranged on his knees, though his eyes are actually closed. Two women of middle age in a conversation that has reached the comfortable point where long silences are as welcome as words. The garden has a small fountain, water from the channel system, directed here for the pleasure of the public space, falling from a carved stone into a basin that is green with algae along its sides and inhabited by a few small fish that hover in the cool shadow of the central jet. The sound of the fountain is light and continuous, exactly the right sound for a warm afternoon, not loud enough to intrude, but present enough to provide a gentle, rhythmic backdrop to the quiet. This is the afternoon in Atlantis. This is the middle of an ordinary day, and it is characterized by a quality that we might, in our own faster world, recognize as a kind of luxury. The luxury of time. Time to eat properly. Time to rest. Time to sit in a garden and talk or not talk as you please. Time to watch the street without any particular reason for doing so. Plato was making a moral argument with Atlantis. As we will see later, he was creating a cautionary tale about the corruption of virtue by wealth and power. But in doing so, he was also, perhaps inadvertently, creating something else, a portrait of a civilization in which the basic conditions of human life, good food, physical rest, meaningful work, community, were met simply and without excessive complexity. A civilization in which the afternoon was not something to be pushed through in pursuit of the evening's productivity, but something to be inhabited gently on its own terms. It is a pleasant thing to contemplate. Let us, in the later afternoon, when the heat has begun to soften and the workshops are reopening, walk through the craftsman's district and see what was being made in Atlantis. Because a civilization of this scale, ruling a territory larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, according to Plato, with great cities and trading networks and the engineering capacity to build concentric rings of stone and water, would have had craftsmen of extraordinary skill, not just the functional craftsmen who make the things the city needs to function, but the artisans who make the things that make life beautiful, that transform the useful into the significant, that allow a civilization to say, in the most permanent language it has, "This is what we valued. This is what we thought was beautiful. This is who we were, the metal workers." Let us begin with them, because Plato makes much of the metals of Atlantis, the orichalcum, the gold, the silver that covered the walls and the roofs of the great temples. Somewhere in this city, there are craftsmen who work in these materials, who know the particular behaviors of heated metal, who have developed over generations the techniques for making a thin sheet of precious metal adhere to a stone surface, for making a cast figure that retains the fine detail of the wax original from which it was cast, for making a piece of jewelry that is both light and strong, that sits comfortably on the body and retains its form through years of daily wear. The metalworker's workshop smells of charcoal and hot metal and the particular sharp acidity of quenching water. It is hotter than any other workshop in the street, even in the cooler part of the afternoon, because the forge must be kept going, and the forge generates heat that spreads through the whole space. The metalworker moves through this heat without particular notice. After years of this work, the warmth of a forge is simply the background condition. No more remarkable than the temperature of the outdoor air is to people who are not working over fire. On the bench, a half-finished piece. It might be a bowl, a large, deep bowl of thin hammered bronze, its surface worked into a pattern of concentric circles that express the same ring within ring geometry as the city itself. The inside surface is rough still, showing the marks of the hammer. The outside has been worked to smoothness with a smaller tool, and then polished to a warm gleam. The rim is not yet finished, its edge still rough where it was cut from the larger sheet. The metalworker picks it up, turns it, looks at the rim, puts it down, picks up a small iron tool, makes several careful strokes along the inside of the rim, puts the tool down, picks up the bowl again. There is no hurry. The bowl will be finished when it is finished. Good work in metal, in any medium, requires the time it requires. And a craftsman who has learned their work well knows this without being told. They have watched impatience ruin good material too many times to be impatient themselves. The weavers. Somewhere in the artisan district, several houses in a row have their doors and windows open to the afternoon air, and from inside each one comes the rhythmic, complex sound of a loom at work, the thud of the beater, the smaller clicking of the heddle moving, the slight slap of the shuttle moving through the warp. These sounds are not unpleasant. They have a regularity that is almost musical, a rhythm that your body responds to without any conscious direction. The way you respond to the sound of rain, or the sound of water running over stones. Inside the workshop, the weavers sit before their looms in a posture that looks uncomfortable to modern eyes, but that, after years of practice, is simply the body's most efficient arrangement for this work. Slightly forward, arms extended, hands moving through the warp threads with a sureness that makes the complex seem simple. The cloth they are making is fine, finer than the plain weave of everyday garments, finer than the cloth made on the farm on the plain. This is cloth for the temple hangings, or for the robes of civic officials, or for the wealthy merchant who has ordered something exceptional for for the wedding of a son or daughter. The colors come from dyes, plant dyes and mineral dyes, developed and refined over generations into a palette that is both beautiful and reproducible. The deep blue of the indigo plant, the rust red of madder, the soft yellow of weld, the particular purple that in the ancient Mediterranean world was worth its weight in silver, made from the murex shellfish. This may or may not be available in Atlantis, but if the civilization had the trading connections that Plato implies, it would have found a way to obtain it. The weaver at the most complex loom is making something with a pattern, a geometric design of interlocking triangles and spirals, the colors changing in regular intervals across the width of the cloth. She does not need to look at the loom to know where she is in the pattern. She carries the entire structure of the design in her body, in the memory of her hands, and the counting mechanism that operates in the background of her mind without any conscious attention. She is talking to the woman at the adjacent loom, a conversation that has been going on, with interruptions, all afternoon, about something that is clearly interesting to both of them. You cannot understand the words, but the tone is animated, punctuated by laughter. The conversation of two people who enjoy each other's company and have work that allows them to be together while they do it. The potters. At the end of the craftsman's street, in a slightly larger space with an open yard behind it for the kiln, the pottery workshop has a quality of quiet precision that distinguishes it from the noisier metalwork and weaving shops. The potter sits at the wheel, a heavy stone wheel set in the floor, turned by kicking its outer rim, and the clay beneath her hands is rising as she works it, the formless lump becoming, with apparently no effort, a cylinder, and then a bowl, and then a vessel of some specific intended form. Watching a good potter work the wheel is one of the more meditative things you can do in an ancient city. The rhythm is slow and hypnotic. The gentle turning of the wheel, the clay rising and opening under the hands, the vessel taking shape as though it has always been there, and the potter is simply revealing it. The hands move with a confidence that is beyond technique. It is the confidence of the body doing something it knows how to do completely, without any need for conscious direction. Around the workshop, finished and drying pots are arranged on shelves. Some unfired, still gray, clay pale, some bisque fired to a rough tan, some finished and glazed and waiting for the final firing. The decoration on the finished pieces is the style of the civilization. Those spirals, those sea wave patterns, those dolphins rendered in the same simplified, expressive shorthand that turns up on Minoan pottery and on Phoenician jewelry and on the rock art of the Atlantic coast peoples. The lines are fluid, confident, made with a brush that has not hesitated. There are other craftsmen here too. A carpenter making furniture in the economical style of the ancient world. Simple forms, joined with mortise and tenon rather than nails. The wood oiled and rubbed but not painted, allowed to show its own grain and color. A shoemaker cutting leather with a curved knife, stitching the cut pieces together with an awl and a heavy linen thread waxed for waterproofness. A basket maker, splitting long wet reeds with practiced thumbs, weaving the strips into forms that are both practical and subtly beautiful. A basket that holds grain is not only a basket that holds grain, It is also a form that satisfies the eye, whose curves and proportions and the tightness of its weave all speak of skill and care. These craftsmen are not artists in the modern, elevated sense. They are not making objects intended purely for contemplation. They are making useful things, and the beauty of what they make is the beauty of the useful thing made well, not separate from function, not opposed to it, but expressed through it. The beautiful bowl is a beautiful bowl because it holds water or food better than an ugly bowl, because its proportions work better in the hand, because its surface has been finished to the right smoothness, because its curves are the curves that the material naturally wants to take when a skilled maker allows it. This is the aesthetic of the ancient world, and it is very different from the aesthetic of our own. Not worse, not better, simply different, more integrated, less anxious. Let us take a slow walk back through the craftsman's street toward the inner rings of the city. The afternoon is moving toward evening now. You can tell by the quality of the light, which has shifted from the white heat of midday to something golden again. The sun lower in the sky, and therefore its light coming at an angle that catches the surfaces of the buildings differently, finds the texture of the stone that was invisible in the direct midday light, brings out the warmth in the colors. The city is waking up from its afternoon quiet. The workshops are all open now, and the sounds of work have resumed. In the street, more people, finishing their errands, moving between one place and another, stopping to talk to someone they know at a workshop door or a street corner. Children have appeared again, moving with the energy of bodies that have rested and are now ready to use the remaining daylight in the most fruitful possible way. Play. A group of 5 or 6 children are playing some kind of running game in the space between 2 buildings, too complex for an observer to fully understand, involving a particular stone and a particular chalk mark on the ground, and a great deal of running and shouting and laughter. The game has its own complete logic, entirely self-referential, entirely serious to its participants. It pauses, briefly, for a dispute about the rules, and then resumes even more intensely. In the late afternoon, when the working day is winding down, but the evening has not yet properly begun, there is often a pause in the city's rhythm. The workers are finishing up and putting away their tools. The market stalls are beginning to close. The children are being called in. In this pause, some people make their way to the temples. Not all of them. Not every day. This is not a civilization of compulsory piety. But the temples are always occupied to some degree, always receiving visitors, always busy with the ordinary commerce between people and their gods that is such a constant feature of life in the ancient world. We have already seen the neighborhood shrines, the small local temples that serve individual districts of the city. Now let us go further in, through the innermost ring of the city, to the great central temples on the hill. You have to enter through one of the gates in the innermost wall, the orichalcum wall, which in the late afternoon light of a clear day seems to gather the gold of the sun and hold it, warmer than the stone around it, like a reflection in living metal. There is a gate here, not guarded in the military sense, but attended by someone, a priest or a civic official, whose function is to give the place a threshold quality, to make it clear that you are passing from one kind of space to another. Inside the innermost ring, the quality of the space changes. It is quieter here. The sounds of the city, even the city as it is now, in this late afternoon stirring, are muffled by the walls, by the distance, by something less physical than walls and distance, which is simply the intention that has been embedded in this space over centuries of use. This is a place set apart, a place where the transactions of ordinary life are held gently at a certain remove. The stone underfoot is a paler color here, and the paving is kept scrupulously clean. The buildings around the central open space are taller and more formal than elsewhere in the city, their proportions more deliberately beautiful, their surfaces more elaborately finished. The great temple of Poseidon. Plato's description of it is extraordinary, and we have already touched on it. The silver exterior, the gold pinnacles, the ivory ceiling inlaid with gold and silver and orichalcum, the great statue of the god in the interior. But let us approach it more slowly, the way someone approaches something they know to be very beautiful and want to arrive at fully prepared. You walk across the open precinct. The ground underfoot is fine white gravel, raked smooth, with a few larger stones placed at regular intervals that serve as markers for the procession routes used during festivals. Around the edges of the precinct are trees, old olive trees and laurels, and between them, stone benches and smaller votive shrines. A few other people are crossing the precinct. A woman walking with deliberate slowness, her hands carrying a small offering in a cloth. Two men who are apparently here for reasons of civic business rather than devotion, talking quietly with the formal but not unfriendly air of people who work near this place and are therefore accustomed to it. You arrive at the entrance to the temple. You stop. The entrance is a double colonnade, columns of the three island stones, white and black and red, alternating so that the row of columns makes a pattern of color that draws the eye forward. The columns are tall, their proportions following some rule of beauty that the builders knew, and that makes the whole entrance feel both monumental and welcoming, as though size here is not about intimidation, but about invitation. Between the outer and inner colonnade is a space that is neither inside nor outside, a threshold space, appropriate to a threshold place. It is cooler here, in the shade of the tall columns. The light is different, filtered through the spaces between the columns, falling in bars that shift slowly as the sun moves. You breathe in this coolness. Inside, the temple is large. Of course, it is large. Plato said it was a stayed in length, but large in a way that is surprisingly comfortable. The ivory ceiling does not press down. It lifts the space upward, its pale color bouncing what light enters through the high windows and the open doors. The gold and orichalcum inlays catch that light and return it in small points and reflections, so that the ceiling seems to be inhabited by slow, warm movement, as though the surface is faintly alive. The statue at the center is enormous, as we know, but let us not approach it too quickly. Let us walk in the space around its edges first, noticing the smaller things. The side altars where votive offerings have accumulated over centuries, small clay figures, fragments of cloth, coins of various types and origins, carved stones, dried flowers long past any freshness. The floor has been worn by generations of feet, the stone slightly concave along the main approach to the altar, testament to all the feet that have crossed it before yours. When you finally arrive at the statue itself, you look up. The scale of it is larger than expected, even though you were told it was large. The carved figure of Poseidon in his chariot, the six-winged horses, the 100 nereids on their dolphins, all of it realized in gold, or gold-plated stone, catching the light from the high windows so that the whole figure seems to move very slightly, seems to breathe. You stand for a moment. It is a very old feeling, this, standing before something made by human hands that attempts to show you something larger than what human hands normally encounter. It is a feeling you might have in a great cathedral, or in a forest of very old trees, or at the edge of the ocean on a clear night when the stars are out in their full number. A feeling of being quite small, in the most comfortable sense, not diminished, exactly, but placed within something that is larger than you, and finding that to be restful rather than frightening. The priests of this temple, and there would be many of them, for a temple of this scale and this significance, occupy a range of roles that are partly religious and partly administrative. Some are concerned with the rituals, the daily offerings, the festivals, the ceremonies of the seasonal calendar. Some are concerned with the accumulated records of the temple, which in a civilization like this one would be stored here, as in a library. The records of the civilization's transactions with its gods, but also the records of its civic life, its laws, its history. Some are concerned with the healing arts, for temples in the ancient world were often the closest thing to a hospital, the place people came when they were ill and when ordinary remedies had failed. The priests you encounter here in the late afternoon are going about their ordinary tasks with the mild attentiveness of people doing work they have done for a very long time. An older priest is moving slowly around the main altar, checking the lamps that line its edge, trimming wicks, refilling oil from a small clay flask. He is completely absorbed in this task, not in a frantic, anxious way, but in the way of a craftsman attending to their material, the kind of attention that makes a small, repetitive task feel complete in itself. Let us leave the temple precinct slowly, passing back through the orichalcum gate and out into the middle rings of the city. The light outside has changed again. It is properly golden now, the late afternoon gold, and the shadows have grown long, stretching out from the base of every wall and column and tree in long dark fingers pointing toward the east. Evening is coming. The day is completing itself. The evening in Atlantis begins with the cooling of the air. It happens quickly in island climates, the shift from the day's heat to the evening's coolness. 1 minute the air is warm and still. The next, a breath moves through the streets, not a proper wind, just a movement of air, and the temperature drops by several degrees, and all of the things that were slightly wilted in the heat, the flowers in pots, the people in their afternoon state of relaxed torpor, seem to lift slightly, revive, find an energy that was set aside during the warmest hours. People come outdoors again in the evening. The streets that were quiet in the afternoon begin to fill. The eating houses open their doors wide, and set out their tables and benches in the street itself, in the evening air, under the beginning stars. Smoke rises from cooking fires. The smell of roasting meat moves through the streets, something for the evening meal, something more festive than the lentils and bread of the midday. This is not a solitary civilization in its evenings. People gather. They gather in the public spaces of the city, the garden by the fountain, the covered walkways along the market square, the steps of the neighborhood temples. They gather in each other's homes, or in the eating houses, or at the water's edge in the inner harbor, where the evening light on the water is particularly beautiful. They talk. What do people talk about? In the evenings in Atlantis, the same things, probably, that people have always talked about. The day that has just passed, the plans for the days ahead, the affairs of the neighborhood, who is ill, who has had a child, who has had a disagreement with whom, the affairs of the city, what the council has decided, what the new building project on the second ring will look like, what the latest ships from the east have brought, the affairs of the wider world, the state of relations with the peoples of the lands to the east, what the last trading expedition found on the coast to the west, what the weather will do in the coming season, and stories. In the evenings, in the ancient world, there are stories. Not reading. Reading is for the day, for the private hours, for the focused attention that a written text requires. Evenings belong to the spoken word, the performed word, the word that exists in the relationship between a teller and an audience. Someone in a group will be known as a good storyteller and will be encouraged to tell a story and will begin with the particular intonation and pacing that marks the beginning of something prepared, not written down, not memorized verbatim, but carried in the mind in the fluid, adaptable way of oral tradition. The story always the same in its essentials, and always slightly different in its particulars, shaped by the audience and the occasion and the mood of the evening. The stories will be of the gods, some of them of Poseidon and Plato, of the 10 founding brothers, of the acts and interventions and love affairs of the divine world that inhabits the same geography as the human one, only at a different level, a deeper level, a level that is not always visible, but is always felt. And some stories will be of heroes, men and women who faced impossible situations and found, in their facing of them, something about what human beings can be at their fullest. And some stories will simply be stories of people, of ordinary people who did something extraordinary by accident, or of extraordinary people who turned out to be quite ordinary at heart, or of the strange turns of fate that bring people to places they never intended to be, and of what they found when they arrived. Sit down at the edge of the group, on one of the low stone seats along the covered walkway of the market square. The lamps have been lit, small clay lamps, each with a single wick, their light warm and unsteady, moving in the faint evening breeze. The faces around you are familiar in the way of people you have been near all day without quite speaking to. The potter from the workshop, with clay still in the creases of her hands. The older man from the quayside, who sat on his coil of rope all morning and is now sitting on a bench in the square, apparently in exactly the same posture. 2 women from the inner residential streets, neighbors of long standing, who argue with the comfortable intensity of people who have argued with each other so many times that the argument itself has become a form of intimacy. The storyteller is a man in late middle age, with a voice that carries without effort. The voice of someone who has been telling stories in public for a long time and has learned how to fill a space with sound without straining. He is telling a story about the sea. Of course he is. This is an island civilization, and the sea is always present in its stories, the way the sky is always present in the stories of nomadic desert peoples, or the forest in the stories of northern woodland peoples. The sea is the context within which everything happens here. The story is about a voyage. Someone left this island long ago, in the time of the grandfathers' grandfathers' grandfathers, and sailed west, sailed beyond the horizon into the unknown ocean, and what they found there, and what happened to them, and how they came back, or did not come back, or came back changed beyond recognition into something that was only partly the person who had left. You do not understand the words, but you understand the tone, the slow building of tension in the journey out, the particular quality of silence that the storyteller creates in the middle section, the moment of encounter with whatever was found out there, the long, careful descent from intensity as the story moves toward its ending, and then the ending, quiet, simple. The lamplight on the faces of the listeners shows them absorbing it, carrying it. A few heads nod slightly, the almost imperceptible nod that means, yes, I recognize this. I have always known this was true, though I could not have said how. Let us breathe in the evening air. Let us sit here for a moment in the warmth of the lamps, surrounded by the sound of other people living their lives. It is a pleasant thing to be near people without needing to be the center of them, to be an observer, a witness to the ordinary, extraordinary spectacle of human beings in community, talking, eating, telling stories, being young and being old, sleeping and waking and sleeping again. The daily cycle of a civilization, the accumulated weight of thousands of ordinary days. Now, as the evening deepens and the lamps burn lower and the first stars appear, let us sit quietly and consider the question at the heart of this story. What actually happened? What did Plato intend? What is the truth of Atlantis? And I ask you to approach this question without urgency, without the grasping need for a definitive answer, because this is, in many ways, the most relaxing thing about the story of Atlantis. It is a story that has been living in the human imagination for 2,300 years without resolution, and it has survived that ambiguity very well. It does not need an answer to be meaningful. It does not need to have been real to be true. Plato wrote about Atlantis in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. These are not stories told for pure entertainment. Plato was a philosopher, and everything he wrote was in service of philosophical inquiry. He was interested, at this point in his life, in questions about ideal societies, about justice and governance, about what it would mean to organize human life optimally. He had already written the Republic, his great vision of what a just city might look like. Now he was thinking about that question from a different angle. Not what should a city be, but what has a city actually been in the deep past, in the time before recorded history. The Atlantis story was his answer to that question, or part of his answer. It was a vehicle for exploring the relationship between virtue and power, between the divine and the human, between the kind of life that leads to genuine flourishing and the kind of life that seems to flourish but is actually decaying from the inside. The story comes from a specific source, or claims to. Plato says that his relative Critias heard it from his own grandfather Critias the Elder, who had heard it from the Athenian statesman Solon, who had heard it from Egyptian priests at the city of Sais during a visit to Egypt around 590 BC. Solon was famous among the Greeks for his wisdom and his travels, and Egypt was famous among the Greeks as the repository of ancient wisdom, a civilization so old that what the Greeks considered history, the Egyptians considered recent news. The priests of Sais, Solon was told, possessed records going back 9,000 years before his visit. That is, approximately 9,500 years before Plato's own time, putting the events in question around 9,600 BCE. The priests told Solon that at that time, Athens, not the Athens of the 5th century BC, but an earlier, more virtuous Athens that had been entirely forgotten, had been the great power of the Eastern Mediterranean, virtuous and just and powerful, and Athens had been threatened by the great empire of Atlantis, which lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and which had been expanding eastward, trying to conquer the entire Mediterranean world. Athens, alone among the nations of that time, had resisted Atlantis. Athens had fought and prevailed, and then, after the victory, both Athens and Atlantis had been destroyed by a great cataclysm, earthquakes and floods, and both had sunk below the sea or been buried under the earth, so thoroughly that no memory of them survived except in the records of the Egyptian priests, who were out of range of the cataclysm, and thus preserved their knowledge of what had once been. This is the framework of the story. And then Plato fills in the picture of Atlantis itself, its founding, its extraordinary physical description, its wealth, its power, its slow moral decline. Because this is the crucial element, the one that distinguishes Plato's Atlantis from a simple tale of a lost paradise. Atlantis did not end because of some arbitrary fate, some accident, some simple bad luck. It ended, in Plato's telling, because the people who lived there changed, because the divine quality that the descendants of Poseidon and Plato had carried in their blood, that grace, that moderation, that ability to hold wealth and power without being corrupted by them, gradually, over many generations, diluted. The human nature in them became stronger than the divine nature, and human nature, unguided by divine wisdom, tends toward excess. They began to want more territory, more gold, more influence, more power. The moderation of the early generations gave way to something hungrier. The wealth that had been held lightly began to be grasped tightly. The justice that had characterized their governance became something more self-interested, more arbitrary, more concerned with maintaining power than with doing right. And the gods saw this. Zeus in particular. In Plato's version, it is Zeus rather than Poseidon who brings the final judgment, though the island originally belonged to Poseidon, called a council of all the gods to decide what should be done about the Atlanteans, who had fallen so far from what they had been. And in Plato's text, the krisis ends there, mid-sentence, as though the pen had simply stopped, as though the writer had decided that the judgment did not need to be stated, that anyone who had followed the story to this point would understand what was coming: the earthquakes, the floods, the island sinking in a day and a night. Let us not end with the sinking. Let us not go there tonight, because the sinking is not really the most important part of the story. What is most important is what came before it. The 10,000 ordinary days of ordinary life in an extraordinary civilization. The mornings and the meals and the work and the stories and the slowly burning lamps and the sound of the water in the channels. The way the three-colored stone of the buildings caught the morning light. The sound of the spindle turning. The cat on the courtyard wall. All of that existed, whether the island existed or not. Whether Plato invented the whole thing or received it from a chain of transmission going back to actual Egyptian records. Whether Atlantis was a real place that really sank, or a philosophical allegory, or a creative work of unprecedented ambition. All of that, the daily life of it, is as real as any daily life that has ever been lived anywhere. Because Plato understood people. He knew what they were like in the morning, in the market, in the temple, in the evening. He had seen enough of human life to describe it truly. And so, when we imagine Atlantis, we are imagining something true, even if we are unsure whether it is also real. Through the centuries since Plato wrote his two dialogues, the question of Atlantis has attracted attention from an extraordinary range of people. Scholars and charlatans, geologists and mystics, philosophers and novelists and archaeologists. Let us sit with some of their ideas for a while, not to argue about them, but simply to notice the different shapes that the story has taken in different hands. The earliest readers of Plato who addressed the question were his own students and near contemporaries, and they were largely skeptical. Aristotle, Plato's most famous pupil, apparently believed, and his comment has come down to us in second-hand form, that Plato invented Atlantis to serve his philosophical purposes, and that the island existed as a teaching device rather than as a historical claim. This is a reasonable position, and it has a great deal to recommend it. Plato was demonstrably comfortable inventing elaborate narratives to make philosophical points. The allegory of the cave, the myth of the story of the ring of Gyges. All of these are clearly fictional and clearly designed to illuminate abstract ideas through concrete storytelling. Why should Atlantis be different? But some of Plato's other contemporaries and early successors took the story more literally, and the tradition of literal interpretation has continued in various forms ever since. The Stoic philosopher Crantor, who wrote one of the first commentaries on the Timaeus in the late 4th century BCE, reportedly believed that the story was a genuine historical account and claimed to have verified it with Egyptian priests. In the centuries that followed, Atlantis became a kind of intellectual wildcard, a story capacious enough to be interpreted in almost any direction one wished. The Roman Pliny the Elder mentions it. The geographer Strabo discusses it with agnostic interest, noting that some find it plausible and others do not, without committing himself. The later Neoplatonic philosophers, Iamblichus, Proclus, took it as an allegory of cosmic spiritual principles, the war between Athens and Atlantis representing the war between the good and the material, between the eternal and the perishable. In the medieval period, Atlantis largely disappeared from European consciousness, the story becoming one of many classical references that medieval scholars knew about, but did not particularly focus on. It was the rediscovery of classical texts during the Renaissance that brought Atlantis back to widespread attention, and the timing of this rediscovery, coinciding with the European encounter with the Americas, gave the story a new and powerfully suggestive resonance. Here was the Atlantic Ocean, which Europeans were now crossing regularly. Here, on the other side of it, were civilizations of extraordinary complexity and achievement, civilizations that had clearly been there for a very long time, civilizations that no classical source had predicted or described. Was this what Plato had been pointing toward? Was Atlantis a memory, distorted, mythologized, but essentially accurate, of some pre-Columbian civilization that had maintained contact with the Mediterranean world in the deep past and then been cut off? The notion took hold, and it has been held by various people in various forms ever since. Francis Bacon, writing in the early 17th century, set his utopian novel New Atlantis explicitly in the Pacific Ocean, imagining that the civilization Plato described had survived, gone underground, and become a society of scientists and philosophers. This is Atlantis as ideal commonwealth, Atlantis as the vehicle for imagining what an enlightened civilization might look like. The same use Plato had put it to, essentially, but now in a specifically modern, scientific register. Athanasius Kircher, the 17th century Jesuit scholar, produced the first modern map of Atlantis, based on his reading of Plato and his own considerable geographical knowledge. He placed it in the middle of the Atlantic, roughly where the mid-ocean ridge actually runs, and oriented his map with south at the top in the old classical cartographic tradition. His Atlantis is a large island, roughly rectangular, with mountain ranges along its northern and eastern edges, and a large central plain, recognizably the Atlantis of Plato's description, just rendered in the idiom of early modern cartography. And then, in 1882, an American politician named Ignatius Donnelly published a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which became one of the most influential books ever written about the subject, and also, many scholars would argue, one of the most catastrophically misleading. Donnelly was not a trained scholar, but he was an extremely energetic and persuasive writer, and his book assembled an enormous amount of evidence, linguistic, archaeological, botanical, mythological, to argue that Atlantis was a literal historical fact, that it was the source of all the world's civilizations, that all the mythology of all cultures was ultimately derived from the actual history of this one island. Donnelly's book was a bestseller, and it remains in print. Its influence on popular culture has been enormous. Almost everything you know about Atlantis from novels and films and television comes, ultimately, from Donnelly or from those he influenced. The idea of Atlantis as a super civilization with advanced technology, the idea of Atlantis as the origin point of all human culture, the idea of Atlantis as a global catastrophe whose survivors seeded the development of Egypt and Mesoamerica and India. All of this comes primarily from Donnelly, not from Plato. Plato's Atlantis is actually much more modest and much more interesting than Donnelly's. It is not a civilization of laser beams and crystal powers. It is a civilization of good agriculture and impressive engineering, of beautiful temples and well-made crafts, of people who started out virtuous and grew corrupt over time. It is recognizable. It is human. And that is precisely why it is such an effective vehicle for Plato's philosophical argument. What do modern scholars think? Most classical scholars and professional historians believe that Plato invented Atlantis, or at most, that he elaborated on some very vague tradition of a real geographic event, perhaps the eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 BCE, which destroyed the Minoan civilization and may have left a folk memory of islands sinking in the sea. The specific details of Plato's Atlantis, its location, its size, its date, are almost certainly Plato's own invention, designed to serve his narrative and philosophical purposes. Some geologists and oceanographers have pointed out that the Atlantic Ocean floor between the Azores and the mid-Atlantic ridge contains evidence of significant geological activity in the deep past, that land masses have risen and sunk in the North Atlantic over geological time, that the Azores themselves are the tips of an underwater mountain range. But the timescales involved, millions of years, not thousands, are so different from Plato's 9,000 years before Solon that any direct connection is very tenuous. The most honest position is also the simplest. We do not know where Plato got the story. We do not know whether any element of it is based on historical fact, and we are unlikely ever to know with certainty. The ocean has not given up any evidence that would settle the question. The Egyptian records that the priests of Sais supposedly showed to Solon have never been found. And this is fine. Not knowing is fine. The lamps in the square have burned lower. Some have gone out entirely, and the people sitting near them have either moved to brighter spots or stayed in the comfortable dimness, which has its own pleasures. The storyteller has finished his story and is now in quiet conversation with two listeners who wanted to ask him questions. The sounds of the city have thinned, not silent, never entirely silent in a city by the sea, but quieter. A dog barks somewhere in the distance and is not answered. Let us think for a moment about what endures. Not physically. We know that Atlantis, whether it was real or invented, left no physical trace that we have found. Nothing endures physically in the end. Even stone wears away. Even gold is lost. What endures is the story. Stories endure. The story of Atlantis has endured for 2,300 years, carried in the human imagination from Plato's hand through the hands of every person who has ever heard it and wanted to tell it again. It has been carried through the collapse of the civilization that produced it, through the centuries when the text was almost lost, through the Arabic translations that preserved it when Europe had forgotten its own classical heritage, through the Renaissance rediscoveries, through the centuries of pseudoscientific enthusiasms and scholarly controversies. It has endured because it addresses something real, not real in the geographical sense. We may never know about that, but real in the human sense. The question of what it would mean to live well, in a civilization together. The question of what happens when material wealth increases faster than moral wisdom. The question of whether there is something in human nature that tends, inevitably, toward excess, toward wanting more than enough, toward grasping, and whether that tendency is simply to be accepted or can somehow be guided, shaped, redirected. These are not abstract questions. They are the questions of every morning, every day, every civilization that has ever tried to organize human life well and found it more difficult than expected. Plato knew this. He wrote Atlantis as a philosophical story, but he wrote it with the vividness and the detail of someone who understood that abstract ideas only take root in the human mind when they are attached to images, to particular things. A street with 3 colored stones, a harbor full of boats, a lamp burning in the evening, a story told to a tired audience at the end of a long day. He gave us an island to lose so that we would know what it felt like to lose something and ask ourselves whether we were doing enough to prevent the loss of what we had. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. Let us go back to the city one more time. It is late evening now, and the city has found its nighttime rhythm. The market square is quiet, the stalls long since closed, their goods locked away. Most of the eating houses have taken in their street furniture, the benches and tables back inside, the lamps extinguished. A few are still open, their doors showing warm light, the occasional voice or burst of soft laughter indicating the last guests of the evening completing their conversations before going home. The streets are dark, but not completely dark. There are the stars, extraordinary in a world without artificial light. The whole brilliant sweep of the Milky Way, clearly visible on a clear night. The stars so numerous and so bright that the sky itself seems slightly luminous, seems to have a faint glow that gives the city a quality of very soft silver illumination, even without any lamps. The 3-colored stone of the buildings reflects this starlight, faintly, in the way that light-colored surfaces always seem to hold a little luminosity, even in darkness. In the inner city, near the orichalcum wall, there are a few small fires still burning in the niches of the wall, maintenance fires, kept going by a night watch, and their warm, flickering light touches the orichalcum surface and makes it move, makes the whole wall seem briefly alive, breathing slowly in the fire's breath. The harbor at night, the last time we will visit it, and it is worth visiting one more time, because at night the harbor is a different place. The working life of it has retired. The merchants are in their beds, the sailors aboard their ships or in the harbor side eating houses. The big ships are moored and still, their reflections in the dark water of the harbor basin broken only slightly by the small movements of the water, the gentle breathing of the sea. Even here in the sheltered inner harbor, the ocean's presence always felt even when it is not visible. The stars reflect in the harbor water too. You can stand on the quay and look down and see the sky doubled, the stars both above and below. And for a moment, the two reflections, the real sky and the water sky, are difficult to distinguish, and you are briefly suspended between them. A single small boat is crossing the harbor, its roar making slow, quiet strokes. A night fisherman, perhaps, going to check a set line in the dark outer harbor, or someone simply crossing from one side to the other. A late return. The oars lift and dip, each stroke making a small sound and a small disturbance in the water that spreads outward and then is gone, absorbed back into the stillness. The boat reaches the other side. The oarsman ties the boat and steps onto the stone quay. For a moment, standing still, they look out over the water, at the harbor, at the ships, at the reflected stars. Then they turn and walk up the quay toward the city, and the harbor returns to its silence, its starlight, its patient breathing. The house at the end of the street. Let us go back to the house we started in this morning. It feels right to end where we began. The house is dark now. The residents are all asleep, or nearly. The courtyard is empty, the fig tree a dark shape against the slightly lighter sky. The door to the main room is shut. Through the high, narrow windows, you can see the very faint warm glow of a small lamp burning at the household shrine near the door, not for light, exactly, but for continuity, for the keeping of a small flame that maintains something that says, "This house is inhabited, this family is present, this life continues." The cat has come down from its wall. It is sitting in the middle of the courtyard, in a patch of starlight, cleaning its face with methodical precision. It pauses in its cleaning and looks toward you with the flat, golden attention of a cat that is not particularly interested, but is registering your presence for the record. Then it returns to its cleaning, working through the same sequence of paw and face that cats have performed since there have been cats, in every civilization, on every island, in every world. Somewhere nearby, the sound of the channel water, running quietly, running always, carrying the cold mountain springs down through the rings of the city to the sea. Somewhere further away, the sea itself, very faint at this distance, in this still night. The faintest suggestion of waves meeting stone, the oldest sound there is, the sound that was here before the city and will be here long after. And the stars, the enormous, unhurried stars, moving on their slow paths across the sky, each one where it has always been, each one moving where it has always moved, the whole celestial mechanism turning overhead with a patience so vast it makes the longest human life seem like a single afternoon. You have spent this evening in a place that may or may not have existed, watching people who may or may not have been real, living lives that may or may not have been lived. And yet something in the watching felt true, something in the quality of the morning light, and the smell of the bread, and the sound of the loom, and the story told in the lamplight was recognizable, was familiar, was, in some deep way, yours. This is the gift of the ancient world, when we approach it gently enough to receive it, the recognition that across the distance of 2,000 years or 9,000 years or however far back you want to reach, the basic texture of human life changes very little. People wake up, they eat, they work, they rest, they love each other or fail to love each other well, and try again. They tell stories. They light lamps against the dark. They look at the stars and feel, briefly, that the world is larger than they are, and find this comforting rather than frightening. Atlantis, whether real or imagined, is a story about this, about the fragility of civilization, yes, but also about its endurance, about the 10,000 ordinary days that come before any catastrophe, and that constitute, in their dailiness and their ordinariness, the actual substance of what it means to live in a world with other people. Plato knew, when he wrote about the three-colored stone and the concentric rings of water and the great golden statue in the dim ivory ceiling temple, that the real Atlantis, the one worth mourning, the one worth imagining, was not the empire or the power or the architectural grandeur. It was the ordinary day. It was the morning meal and the afternoon rest and the evening story and the lamp that burned all night at the household shrine. It was people living in their imperfect and beautiful and temporary way in the world they had been given. As you rest here, let us consider very softly, without urgency, without needing to resolve anything what the physical world has to say about Atlantis. The ocean is old. The Atlantic Ocean began opening about 200 million years ago when the supercontinent Pangaea began to break apart and the landmass that would become the Americas began slowly drifting westward, away from what would become Europe and Africa. The ocean grows wider by a few centimeters each year as the mid-ocean ridge, the underwater mountain range that runs roughly down the middle of the Atlantic, creates new seafloor. Along this mid-ocean ridge, there are places where the ridge rises above the ocean surface. The Azores, for example. 9 small Portuguese islands in the middle of the North Atlantic, volcanic in origin, their peaks the visible summits of an underwater mountain range. The Azores sit on what geologists call the Azores Triple Junction, where 3 tectonic plates meet, which makes them geologically active and accounts for their relatively recent volcanic origin. Could the Azores be the remnant of a larger landmass? In the very long geological past, before the Atlantic opened fully, the ridge was certainly above water in more places than it is now. But the very long geological past means millions of years ago, long before any human civilization existed, long before any human beings existed. There is no geological evidence for a large inhabited landmass in the Atlantic that sank in anything like the historical period. The most specific geological event that has been seriously proposed as a source for the Atlantis story is the eruption of Thera, the volcanic island in the Aegean Sea, around 1600 BCE. This eruption was one of the largest in recorded geological time. It destroyed the island's central cone, left the caldera that is now the distinctive shape of modern Santorini, and sent tsunamis throughout the eastern Mediterranean. It almost certainly contributed to the collapse of the Minoan civilization, the sophisticated Bronze Age culture centered on the island of Crete. The parallels with Atlantis are suggestive. A wealthy, powerful island civilization suddenly destroyed by a geological catastrophe, sinking, partially. Thera didn't entirely sink beneath the sea. Plato's dates are wrong by a factor of 10. He says 9,000 years before Solon, when Thera's eruption was only about 1,000 years before Solon. But errors of this kind are exactly what you would expect in a story transmitted orally through many generations. Other candidates have been proposed. The Canary Islands, which were inhabited in antiquity by a Berber people called the Guanches. The Spartal Island off the coast of Morocco, which did sink in the geologically recent past. Cuba. The Bahamas. Sardinia, argued for with great energy by the journalist Sergio Frau. Antarctica, before the ice cap covered it, proposed by various people with varying degrees of seriousness. None of these candidates perfectly fits Plato's description, which is itself internally inconsistent in some details. The honest truth is that the evidence points most strongly toward a literary invention rather than a historical location. But the ocean keeps its secrets, and it is a very large ocean. Let us let this question rest, very gently, without needing to resolve it. Let the ocean keep its secrets for tonight. Let the question be a comfortable one, a question that is pleasant to carry without an answer, the way some questions are. In the 2,300 years since Plato wrote the Timaeus and Critias, the story of Atlantis has been told and retold in more forms than can easily be counted. It has been told as history, as allegory, as geological theory, as mystical revelation. It has been told as a cautionary tale about imperial overreach, and as a nostalgic celebration of a lost golden age, and as a scientific hypothesis about the origins of civilization, and as the background material for films and novels and comics and video games. The story has been translated into dozens of languages and has been read on every inhabited continent. It has attracted the attention of scholars and dreamers and fraud artists and sincere eccentrics and careful geologists and imaginative poets. It has been illustrated, mapped, modeled, argued over, dismissed, revived, dismissed again, and revived again. None of this would be possible if the story were merely a philosophical argument. Philosophical arguments, however brilliant, do not typically generate 2 millennia of continuous fascination. They do not inspire children to wonder about the bottom of the ocean, or tourists to stare out at the Atlantic from the cliffs of the Azores and feel a strange pull toward the horizon. What generates that kind of fascination is not an argument, but an image. And Plato, whatever else he was doing, gave the world an image so compelling that it has kept 2,300 years of imaginations busy. An island, three-colored stone, concentric rings of water, a city that glowed with warm reddish metal in the afternoon sun, an ordinary morning in an extraordinary place, bread baking, water running in channels, the sound of a loom. We have walked a long way today in this gentle place. We began in the morning, watching the light come up over the three-colored stone of the city, smelling the bread, sitting at the low table with the family. We walked through the market and along the quay and across the great plain. We watched the craftsmen work and the children play and the old woman sit in the sun. We ate the main meal and rested in the afternoon and listened to a story in the evening. And now it is night. The city is asleep. Imagine it from above, if you like, from a great height, the way a bird sees things, or the way the stars see things. The island below, dark mostly, with only scattered points of light where lamps or fires are still burning. The concentric rings of the city, visible in the starlight as a pattern of dark water and slightly lighter land. The city's structure still legible even in the dark. The great plain, flat and dark, and very still, the roads crossing it in straight silver lines of pale stone. The mountains along the northern coast, their peaks above the clouds if there are clouds, their dark shapes familiar and permanent. The harbor, with the ships at their moorings. The single working lamp at the harbor entrance, burning for the safety of any late arrival. The sea, extending in every direction, moving gently in the dark. It swells long and slow, each one traveling miles before it breaks anywhere. The oceans breathing, in and out, in and out. The stars overhead, every star where it belongs. And somewhere in the city, in one particular house on one particular street, a small lamp burning at a household shrine. A cat in a courtyard, asleep now, curled in a perfect circle on a warm stone. The fig tree in the corner, its leaves very still in the windless night. All of it resting, all of it at peace. This is Atlantis at rest. This is the island that Plato dreamed, or remembered, or invented, and the distinction matters less than the image itself, which is complete and real and true in all the ways that matter for sleeping and for dreaming. Let this image be with you tonight, if you would like it. The three-colored stone, the gentle water in the channels, the lamp at the shrine, the cat on the stone, the sea breathing, very slowly, all the way to the horizon and beyond. Let all of it be gentle. Let all of it be slow. Let the day dissolve into the ocean, very quietly, the way the colors of a sunset dissolve into the dark blue of evening, gradually, without any sudden moment of transition, the brightness simply becoming less and less until the dark is all there is, and the dark is good, and the dark is where you want it to be all along. In 360 BCE, the year Plato was writing, the stars above the Mediterranean looked almost exactly as they look now. The sky changes very slowly. The precession of the Earth's axis shifts the position of the celestial pole over thousands of years, so that the star that marks north changes. In Plato's time, it was not Polaris, but a different star, Caucabe, a slightly fainter star in the same constellation. But the patterns of the stars themselves, the constellations, the great river of the Milky Way, the particular intensities of the individual stars, these have changed so little in 2,000 years that a person transported from 360 BCE to our own time would find the night sky entirely familiar. The people of Atlantis, whether they lived in 9,600 BCE as Plato claimed, or in some more recent period, or only in Plato's imagination, looked up at a sky that was, give or take some small details, the same sky you can see on a clear night, the same Orion, the same Pleiades, the same Milky Way, that great diffuse band of light that is the combined illumination of several 100 billion stars, all of them too far away to be seen individually, visible only as this soft, brilliant cloud. In the ancient world, the stars were navigational instruments. The fishermen and the sailors read them the way we read roads and signs, using them to find direction and to understand the time of year. But they were also more than that. They were the visible evidence of an order in the universe, the fact that the sky moved predictably, that the same stars rose and set on the same schedule year after year after year, that the planets moved against the background of the stars in patterns that could be, with patience, understood. All of this was deeply reassuring. It said, the universe has a structure. There is an arrangement. Things follow rules. For a people who lived on an island in the middle of a vast ocean, this cosmic orderliness would have been especially comforting. On the ocean, you can be lost. The sea has no landmarks, no roads, no signs. But the stars are always there, on a clear night, telling you exactly where you are. The sky is the map that the ocean cannot provide. The last thing we will imagine tonight is this: someone in Atlantis, on an ordinary clear night, lying on the flat roof of their house in the warmth of the summer darkness, looking up at the stars. They are not in a hurry. They have nothing that needs doing. The day is finished, and the night has been given to them, and they are using it in the best possible way, which is simply to be present in it. They are looking at a particular star, one they know from childhood, one that their grandmother pointed out to them when they were small and sleepless one summer night, picking them up and carrying them to the roof and pointing and saying a name in that language we cannot hear. They have thought of that star as theirs ever since, their star, in the nonsensical but true way that people form attachments to particular stars, as though the star might notice them in return. The star is completely indifferent, of course. It is a ball of fire several times larger than our sun, so far away that the light now arriving in this person's eyes left its source before they were born, before their parents were born, before their grandparents' were born. The star has no idea they exist. The star will still be burning, largely unchanged, long after this island, this city, this civilization, this person, and all the stories told about them have been forgotten. But they look at it anyway, and the looking is a form of contact. Not between them and the star is unaware. Between them and the universe, between them and the deep fact of existing in a world this large and this old and this beautiful. Between them and the strange, quiet miracle of being conscious at all, of being the kind of creature that can look at stars and feel something when it does. This feeling, this particular feeling of smallness and largeness at once, of being a very small part of something very large, and finding this to be not frightening but consoling, this feeling is not unique to Atlantis. It belongs to every civilization that has ever lay on its back under the stars and looked up. It belongs to you tonight, if you will let it. Before we arrive at our final rest, let us spend a little more time with the youngest members of this civilization, because children are always the most honest mirror of the world they live in. They have not yet learned to pretend. They respond to the actual texture of their days with complete directness, and so in watching children, you see the truth of a place more clearly than in any official description or architectural monument. The children of Atlantis wake up hungry. This is universal and eternal. Children wake up hungry. The first thing a child in an Atlantis household wants, before the formal morning meal has been prepared, is something to eat immediately, and the household has accommodations for this in the form of dried figs in a clay pot near the door and a piece of yesterday's bread on the shelf. The fig is sticky and concentrated with sweetness, the bread slightly hard, but still perfectly edible, and the child eats standing up, already thinking about the day, already planning, already calculating what needs to happen today, and in what order. In the inner city, children from neighboring households often gather in the morning before the formal duties of the day begin. There might be 4 or 5 or 6 of them in an alley between 2 streets, a space too narrow for carts, used by the neighborhood as a kind of informal outdoor room, a threshold space between the private courtyard and the public street. In this space, in the early morning, with the light still golden and the stones still cool, the children of the neighborhood have been meeting for as long as any of them can remember. What do they talk about? The things that have happened. The ship that came in yesterday with the unusual cargo, someone saw it, or saw someone who saw it, and has a report that is probably partly accurate and partly creative interpretation. The argument between 2 adults that the children witnessed from the roof, and have been discussing since, analyzing its content and its subtext with the merciless acuity that children bring to adult behavior. The game that is currently the dominant game, a game that moves through childhood communities the way fashions move through adult ones, suddenly everywhere, and then, after a few weeks, completely abandoned in favor of something new. There is a boy of about 10, let us call him by a name that sounds neither Greek nor Egyptian, something invented, something that might belong to the language we cannot hear. Tevo, perhaps, or Marin, or Eris. He is not the largest child in the group, but he is the most talkative, the one with the most opinions, the one who is constantly producing theories about how things work and why things happen the way they did. He is probably going to be either an excellent trader or a philosopher, possibly both. There is a girl, slightly older, who watches Tevo's theories with the expression of someone who has heard them before and has already identified their weaknesses. Her name might be something like Sally, or Kara, or Remy. She does not bother arguing most of the time. She simply waits. And when the theory has run its course, she says the one thing that reveals its central flaw and moves on. She is going to be important in this civilization. Whatever role is available to women of intelligence and precision in Atlantis, and in a civilization that has been functioning for 9,000 years, surely some such role exists. She will occupy it well. The younger children in the group follow the older ones with the earnest, slightly exhausting attentiveness of the young trying to keep up, offering small contributions that are not quite on the point of the current conversation, but demonstrate that they are paying attention, that they are here, that they want to be included. The school, if there is one, begins later in the morning. Let us imagine it as a covered space in the market district, a long colonnaded room open on one side to a courtyard, its 3 walls lined with wooden benches. Perhaps 12 or 15 children of various ages sit on these benches, and at the front, sitting on a slightly higher seat, is the teacher. The teacher is an older person, perhaps 60, with the calm, slightly weary authority of someone who has been explaining the same fundamental things to new sets of children for 30 years. They are good at this. They have developed, over decades, a vocabulary of explanation that is precisely calibrated to the capacities of young minds. Concrete before abstract. Example before principle. The known before the unknown. Today's lesson might be, we cannot know, of course, but let us imagine numbers, the principles of counting and of calculation, which a trading civilization needs its citizens to understand at a functional level, and which some students will go on to develop into something more complex. The basic mathematics of the calendar, of land measurement, of engineering. The teacher is moving through a series of examples, each one building on the previous, and the children are following. Some with the bright, slightly impatient attention of children for whom numbers come easily, who are already ahead of where the teacher is going. Some with the slower, more effortful attention of children for whom abstraction is hard, who need the concrete example to be held in place for longer before the abstract principle will reveal itself. There is, as always in any classroom, in any civilization, one child who is not paying attention. They are looking out through the open side of the colonnade at the market courtyard beyond, watching a cart being unloaded by 2 men who are working with the coordinated efficiency of people who have done this particular task together many times. The child watches the men with the same quality of absorbed attention that a more compliant student might give to the teacher's demonstration. They are not failing to learn. They are learning something else, something about the physical world and its operations, something that will later connect in unexpected ways to everything else they know. The teacher says their name. They turn back. There is a brief negotiation of attention, accomplished without drama, and the lesson continues. Midday. The children are released from their formal obligations, and the afternoon becomes their own. This is the best part of the day, and they move into it with a speed and a certainty of purpose that is one of the most beautiful things about childhood. Knowing exactly what you want to do and going directly to do it. The harbor. The children often end up at the harbor because the harbor is the most interesting place in the city, and because there is always something happening there, and because the adults who work at the harbor are mostly too busy to pay much attention to children who stay out of the way. You can learn a great deal at the harbor if you know how to be unobtrusive. Tevo and Selly and the others, they are at the outer edge of the quay now, sitting with their feet hanging over the water, watching a ship being prepared for departure. The sailors are moving over the ship with the fluid competence of people entirely at home on a moving surface, hauling on ropes and calling to each other in voices that carry the particular confidence of people who know their work. The children watch with complete attention, tracking each action, asking each other quiet questions about what is happening and why, filling in the answers from what they already know and what they are able to figure out. One of the sailors, a young woman, perhaps 25, with the rope-calloused hands and the particular ground-level balance of a sailor on the quayside, notices the children and stops for a moment. She says something to them. They answer, animated now, with questions. She answers 2 or 3 questions, and then she has to get back to work. But the exchange has been warm, informal, the easy interaction of adults and children in a community where children are not hidden away from the real world, but are allowed to be present in it. The ship departs. The children watch it until it has passed through the great channel and out into the open sea, where it becomes smaller and smaller, and then turns slightly south, and the sail fills, and they can see it still, but it is small now, a white shape on the blue. They watch it for a while longer after they can no longer make out its details. The way you keep watching the place in the sky where a bird was even after the bird has gone. Then they turn back to the city, and the afternoon begins its long descent toward evening. We have spent our time in Atlantis in what seems like summer or early autumn, the warm, golden, dry season of a Mediterranean island, when the days are long and the food is abundant and the sea is gentle enough for easy sailing. But the year turns in Atlantis as it turns everywhere, and each season has its own character, its own quality of life. The rains come in autumn. On an island in the Atlantic, the autumn rains are different from the rains of the eastern Mediterranean, wetter, longer, driven by storms that come in from the west, from the open ocean, storms that carry with them the full weight of all that water. The island watches these storms come in from the sea, from the west, visible first as a darkening of the horizon, a graying of the air, a change in the quality of the light. The seabirds change their behavior before the storms arrive, moving differently, calling differently, and the people who spend their lives watching the sky and the sea have learned to read these signs. When the rains come, the city changes. The three-colored stone goes dark with water, and the colors in it deepen and intensify. The red stone more deeply red, the white more purely white, the black more absolutely black. The channels run fuller, carrying more water down from the mountains where the rain is falling heaviest. The streets empty of casual visitors and fill instead with purposeful movement. People completing their errands quickly, their outer garments pulled close, moving with a particular speed, but not quite running of someone who is getting wet and has decided to accept it but sees no reason to take longer than necessary. Inside the houses, the fires are lit. The main hearth in the interior room, which has been cold since late spring, is laid with wood and kindling and lit with the small ceremony that the first fire of the season always receives. A moment of attention, of acknowledgement that the year has turned, that the season has come, that the house needs warmth now. The fire catches. The room fills with the smell of wood smoke and the light changes, adding to the gray daylight coming through the windows a warm, moving, golden quality that transforms the room completely. The house becomes a different kind of space in winter than in summer. More inward, more unclosed, the focus of life drawn from the courtyard and the street to the hearth, to the circle of warmth. The food changes too. The fresh fish and fresh fruit and fresh vegetables of summer give way to the stored and the preserved. The grain from the storage jars, ground and baked into the dense breads of winter. The dried legumes, lentils and beans and chickpeas that have been stored in clay vessels against exactly this season. The preserved olives in their brine, the dried figs and dates, the hard cheeses that have been ripening since summer, the wine that has been fermenting since the grape harvest, now ready. Winter food is not lesser food. It is different food, heavier, more sustaining, the kind of food that is designed to carry people through the dark months, to keep the body warm from the inside while the fire keeps the room warm from outside. The soup that simmers on the hearth all day, filling the house with a smell of garlic and herbs, and the deep umami of slow-cooked legumes. The bread torn from the loaf and dipped in oil and eaten close to the fire. The cup of wine, well diluted, held in both hands for the warmth of the clay. In winter, the evenings are longer, and this is when the oral traditions of the civilization are most fully expressed. With darkness coming early and the outdoors closed off by rain or cold, people gather more intensely around the fire and the lamp. The stories are longer in winter. There is time for them, and the dark outside makes the warmth inside feel more precious, makes the circle of firelight feel more significant, makes the human voice telling a story more necessary. Spring, when it comes, arrives first in the behavior of the birds and the plants. The fig tree in the courtyard putting out its first small leaves before any warmth is really perceptible in the air. The birds changing their songs, the quality of the light shifting from the flat gray of winter to something more directional, more interested. And then, a week or two later, the air itself changes. The first warm day of spring, when the temperature is almost exactly what you need it to be, and the sky is washed clean by the last of the winter rains, and everything smells of wet stone and green things and the sea, and people come out of their houses blinking into the light and stand in the street and feel, briefly, as though they are new. The spring planting on the Great Plain is a collective event, an entire community out in the fields together, working the soil that has been rested and rained on all winter, planting the seed grain that has been carefully selected and stored. This is one of the year's most significant ceremonies. Not a religious ceremony exactly, though there are prayers and small offerings at the field's edge before the first seed goes in. More of a civic ceremony, a communal act that reminds everyone that they are part of something together, that the grain in the field feeds all of them, that what happens in the next few months depends on both the weather and the work. And then summer again, the long, golden, warm summer, the season we began in, the season that feels, in an island civilization with good harvests and a peaceful sea, like the reward for having made it through the dark. The year turns and turns and turns, each season doing what seasons do, taking its time about it, arriving without apology and departing without drama. Plato tells us that the early generations of Atlantis lived in a long peace, not a peace enforced by the absence of conflict. The Atlanteans were a military power, according to Plato, with a great army and navy, but a peace that arose from the sufficiency of their wealth and the moderation of their desires. They had what they needed. They treated each other fairly. The laws were just, and the justice was consistent. What does a long peace feel like from the inside? It feels, mostly, like nothing, like the ordinary, like the absence of any quality of emergency, any heightened attention required by threat or crisis. The long peace is experienced not as a continuous positive sensation, the way a beautiful sunset is experienced, as something you notice and appreciate, but as a background condition, the way good health is experienced, something you are aware of primarily in its absence. When the headache arrives or the fever starts, and you remember, with a pang of longing, what it felt like when everything simply worked. People in the long peace do not think often about the peace. They think about their bread and their children and their work and their arguments. They think about whether the spring will be wet or dry, and whether the harbor master is going to raise the docking fees again, and whether the carpenter did a good job on the new bench or not. The peace is what allows them to think about these small things, the fact that there are no larger things pressing in from the outside demanding all their attention. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone becomes aware of it. An old person, perhaps, lying in the sun in the courtyard in the late morning, suddenly aware that they have lived in this city for 70 years, and it has always been approximately like this. That the same harbor has always been there. That the same market has always been there. That the quality of the light on the three-colored stone has always been the same quality of light. That the bread has always tasted like this. There is a particular form of gratitude that this awareness brings, and it is different from the gratitude for specific gifts, for a good harvest, for a recovered illness, for a child safely born. It is the gratitude for continuity, for persistence, for the fact that the ordinary world has continued to be ordinary without collapsing. It is not a dramatic gratitude. It does not produce celebrations or prayers of exceptional intensity. It produces something quieter, a stillness, a kind of attentiveness, a feeling of being very glad to be here. This is the feeling that Plato was pointing toward when he described the virtue of the early Atlanteans. Not virtue as heroic moral achievement, not virtue as the dramatic resistance of temptation, but virtue as the quieter capacity to live within what you have and find it sufficient. The capacity to sit in the sun of an ordinary morning and be glad of it, without immediately wanting to change it or improve it or take more of it. It is a capacity that, Plato tells us, the Atlanteans eventually lost. And it is a capacity that, in our own time, in our own lives, we sometimes lose and then find again, and then lose again, in the ordinary rhythm of human consciousness. The story of Atlantis is, among many other things, a story about this capacity, about the difficulty of holding what you have lightly enough that it does not hold you, about the way that material success, accumulated over generations, can subtly and gradually shift from being the means of a good life to being its purpose, and how this shift, once made, is very hard to unmake. Plato believed that this shift was inevitable for civilizations that accumulated great wealth. He was not optimistic about the long-term prospects of powerful empires. He thought the seeds of their destruction were planted in the very soil of their success. And whether or not he was right about Atlantis specifically, the historical record of actual civilizations provides a fair amount of support for the general principle. But that is for the historians and the philosophers. Tonight, we are not here for the destruction. We are here for the 10,000 ordinary days before it. We are here for the morning meal, and the afternoon rest, and the children at the harbor, and the lamp at the shrine. We are here for the cat on the warm stone in the starlight. And the cat, for its part, is exactly where it wants to be. The island rests. The city rests. The three-colored stone is cool in the night air, giving back the last of the day's warmth to the slow dark around it. The channels run their quiet course. The harbor holds its sleeping ships. The great temple on the innermost hill is dark and still, the golden statue invisible in the darkness, the ivory ceiling white as a closed eye. On the plain, the crops stand in the night field. The animals in their shelters breathe their slow animal breath. The grain in the storage jars continues its patient, imperceptible work of being grain, of being food, of being the substance that will become, tomorrow, the bread that someone will eat at a low table in the early morning light. In the houses, people sleep. The children first, they fell asleep where they were, almost, pulled under by the sheer weight of the day's living. The adults later, coming to their sleeping mats in the dark, arranging themselves with the small, habitual adjustments of someone returning to a familiar comfort, and then releasing, finally, the held breath of the day, and sinking. The old, last of all or first, perhaps, in the light sleep that old age brings, where sleeping and waking are not so very different, where the night is less a break from consciousness than a gentle darkening of it. The old person's thoughts in the dark are quiet and slow, moving among memories and half-memories, the faces of people long dead, the rooms of houses long gone, the particular smell of a spring morning from 30 or 40 or 50 years ago that returns, perfectly preserved, in the dark, for no reason, and is welcomed. The sea breathes. Long, slow swells moving across the face of the deep ocean, each one traveling for thousands of miles before it arrives at the stone walls of the city and breaks, very gently, in the night. The sound of this breaking is very faint here in the inner rings of the city, filtered by walls and water and distance. But it is there, always there, the oldest sound in this place, the sound that was here before the city and will be here, is always here, regardless. In and out, in and out. You are very comfortable now, wherever you are. Your body has found its position, the one it was looking for, the one that asks nothing of it. Your breathing has matched itself, perhaps, to some slow rhythm, the rhythm of the story, or the rhythm of that imagined sea, or simply the body's own rhythm, which it has been keeping, quietly and without fuss, for as long as you have been alive. There is nothing more to do tonight. There's nothing more to understand, or resolve, or figure out. Atlantis rests in the deep ocean of the past, or in Plato's mind, or in the imagination, yours and mine, and everyone's who has ever heard this story, and let themselves go there, just for a little while, to that impossible island with its three-colored stone, and its ringing of concentric water. It is a good place to have visited. It is a good place to carry quietly as you go towards sleep. The lamp at the household shrine burns smaller. The cat on the warm stone is dreaming, its paws moving very slightly. following something in the dark country of cat dreams. The fig tree in the corner of the courtyard is perfectly still. The stars turn overhead in their patient, enormous arcs. The night holds everything. Let go of the day. Let go of all the thinking, all the figuring out, all the small urgencies that have been following you since this morning. Let them drift. Now, let them become distant, like the sound of a city heard from the roof at midnight, present, perhaps, but not pressing. There, but not requiring anything. Let yourself be here instead, in this good dark, in this gentle quiet, in and out, in and out. The island sleeps. You sleep. The ocean breathes. Good night.